Chapter 603. A few days later, Sergei returned to the stronghold and reported to Dudian, "Master, everything has been prepared. Nicholas and Glenn are waiting for you." Dudian accompanied Aisha to sit on a stone and looked at the distant sunset. He didn't look back as he heard Sergei's words. "Has the news been leaked?" Sergei quickly replied, "No, I only told Glenn, Nicholas, and your two friends as you told me. No one else knows." Dudian nodded as he looked at the sunset. He mocked in his heart. The night was coming. Even the dazzling sun had been eroded into blood red. Was it a sign of something? He slowly got up and patted the dust on his sleeve. He held Aisha's hand and whispered, "We can go home now." Aisha silently got up. Her expression was indifferent. Sergei's heart palpitated as he looked at Aisha. Every time he faced her, he had the feeling of living with a tiger. He couldn't help but want to leave as soon as possible. But he knew that the girl's position in Dudian's heart was quite high. He had never seen this cold-blooded boy be so intimate and gentle to anyone. Dudian put a few fully charged super batteries into the hunter's backpack and gave it to Sergei. He took the lead and went to the rope in front of the giant wall. He looked at Aisha. He didn't see any instructions for climbing. He reached out and hugged her waist. His other hand grabbed the rope and his legs clamped the lower end of the rope. He climbed up with one hand. Sergei was afraid that the rope would be too heavy and break. He didn't dare to keep up. He stood on the ground and watched the figures of Dudian and Aisha gradually go to the top of the giant wall. He didn't expect that the mysterious girl would be so obedient to Dudian. The intimate relationship between the two was obvious. He was in awe of Dudian. Dudian didn't look down as he climbed to the top of the giant wall. He used the rope to jump up and landed on the giant wall. He looked at Sergei, who had just climbed up the rope. He didn't urge Sergei. He waited while looking at the mountains and the land inside the giant wall. The corner of his mouth slightly curved. After a moment, Sergei climbed up the giant wall and said, "I've let young master wait for a long time. Let's go." Dudian held Aisha in one hand as he came to the other side of the giant wall and slid down the rope. The night quietly arrived. The stars were shining brightly in the night sky. In front of a luxurious manor in a bustling town in the commercial district, carriages arrived one after another. The carriages didn't stop outside the gate like ordinary noble guests. Instead, they drove directly to a spacious open space in the manor. The people who got off the carriages wore strange masks. Under the guidance of the attendants, they entered the brightly lit castle of the manor. Unlike the quiet manor, there was a bustling sound coming from the depths of the manor. It was like a lively market during the day. Masked figures were wandering in the square. They were picking the materials they needed or the latest news from the area. In addition, there were some alchemists and potion masters who were selling their work. Hawkeye stood by the window and quietly looked at the familiar night scenery. After a moment, the door behind him was pushed open. A handsome boy who was 17 or 18 years old stepped into the room. He looked arrogant. "Hawkeye, the meeting is about to begin. Have you prepared the materials that the elders asked you to prepare?" Hawkeye frowned slightly. He didn't like to be disturbed, and at this moment the person he disliked the most was doing the thing he disliked the most. His golden eyes flashed with killing intent, but he quickly hid it, including the anger in his heart. He turned and smiled. "Secretary Mar, I have prepared the materials. I can hand them over to the elders at any time." The arrogant boy coldly snorted. "Come to the conference room if you are ready. Don't let everyone wait for a long time." "Okay, I'll be right there." Hawkeye smiled. The arrogant young man immediately turned around and left. He grabbed the door handle and casually closed it. With a bang, the door frame trembled slightly. Hawkeye's smile suddenly disappeared. He grabbed an expensive art cup next to him and slammed it against the wall, breaking it into pieces. He grabbed the materials on the bookshelf next to him and went out of the door. In the conference room, 7 figures sat on both sides of the round table. At the head of the table sat an old man with a hunched back. His face was full of wrinkles, and he looked no different from an ordinary old man on the street. On his finger was an inconspicuous dark green jade thumb ring. Only a few people knew that the price of this thumb ring alone was equivalent to 50% of the wealth of any of the 6 consortiums. The door of the conference room was pushed open. The arrogance on the boy's face had long disappeared. He humbly bowed in front of the old man and whispered, "Elder Hawkeye is here." The old man's eyelids were still half closed. He didn't respond and just gently nodded. Soon Hawkeye also entered the room. He glanced at the boy standing behind the old man. At this moment, the boy's face no longer had any arrogance. He only took a glance before turning his head and saying to the old man, "Elder, I have prepared the information you wanted." With that said, he handed the information in his hand to the old man with both hands. The old man didn't take it. The boy deftly took it and respectfully placed it on the table in front of the old man. The old man was silent for a moment. He slowly said, "Everyone, the elders' meeting will be held in a few days. Every elder meeting is nothing more than to discuss the ranking. According to the performance of our 9th district in the past 6 months, what do you think our 9th district will be ranked after this meeting?" Hearing this, the complexion of the 6 people slightly changed. One of them with a voluptuous figure immediately said, "Elder, you can't blame us. If you want to blame someone, you can only blame the previous elder. Not only did he not do anything, he even dismissed us 6 counselors. Moreover, he even imprisoned me in the dungeon. Fortunately, Elder came and freed me. Otherwise, our 9th region would be even weaker." "Yes," another tall and sturdy man said in a low voice. "Elder, we have tried our best to develop, but after the previous elder removed the 6 counselors, he suddenly disappeared. During the period of his appointment, he didn't do anything. When our 9th region was invaded, he completely ignored it, causing us to suffer heavy losses. If it wasn't for him, our 9th region would have been able to maintain its status and even have the possibility to rise." "That's right," another person immediately added. "Elder, if it weren't for your timely arrival, our 9th district would have no one to lead us, and it would have been even more chaotic. I'm afraid that we might even be at the bottom. Although I've spent a lot of effort to nurture a lot of promising newcomers, but after all, time is limited. I believe that by the next elder meeting, we will definitely be able to restore our 9th district's ranking." The old man slightly raised his hand to stop the others who wanted to speak. He indifferently said, "I know that the previous elder has a great responsibility. But during my tenure, how are the tasks that I assigned to you all?" Hearing this, everyone was startled. They looked at each other with ugly expressions. "As counselors, I am very disappointed that you all have such neglectful performance. The chairman is also very disappointed," the old man said indifferently. Hearing the 2 words chairman, everyone's face slightly changed. A trace of awe flashed in their eyes. "This time, our ranking will definitely fall," the old man slowly said. "But considering the previous elder's bad influence, I will take full responsibility this time. However, I hope that during the next elder meeting, everyone will not make things difficult for me. If I am difficult, everyone will be difficult. Do you understand?" Everyone had different thoughts. They lowered their heads and said, "Yes." "Good." The old man's eyes slightly flashed. He glanced at everyone and ordered Hawkeye, "Pass the information to everyone. Everyone, this is the latest information about the 8th and 11th district. Take a good look at the increase in their number of 3-star alchemists and the identity of a new 5-star potion master in the 8th district." A new 5-star potion master appeared in the 8th district? Everyone was slightly surprised. They immediately grabbed the information and looked at it. The old man slowly said, "When this meeting of the elders is over, I plan to take over the Reyes Street in the Eastern District." That's the ancestral land of the Huashing Financial Group's Moss family. If we can take over that place, we might be able to seize the Moss family by the throat. In this way, we can also make up for the losses brought by the previous elder. At this point, a cold wind suddenly blew in from outside, causing the temperature in the room to instantly drop. Chapter 604. Hearing this, everyone was shocked and looked over. Behind the old man, there was a tall figure. When they saw this person's face, the 6 counselors on both sides of the conference table suddenly widened their eyes and said in shock, "It's you!" They didn't expect to see this former elder again. Wasn't he wanted by the chairman? How dare he appear here in public? At this time, someone noticed that this former elder didn't come alone. There was a figure standing in the dark behind him, like a ghost. Judging from the figure's outline, it seemed to be a woman, just like his shadow. The old man felt as if a fierce tiger was looking down at him from above, as if the slightest abnormality would cause him to suffer a thunderous attack. He did not panic, and his expression did not change, but his shoulders suddenly moved, and a hard force burst forth from his bones. He believed that this move would not only shake off this hand, but would also be able to injure this person. After all, not just anyone could casually place a hand on his shoulder. However, as soon as this hard force rose, he felt his shoulder suddenly sink. The palm on his shoulder was like a huge mountain pressing down heavily. Not only did it cancel out all the force he had burst out, but it also directly crushed over. With a bang, the legs of the chair he sat on exploded. His body shook, and he felt a slight stuffy in his chest, as if he couldn't breathe. The old man was shocked and couldn't help turning his head to look, but he saw a handsome young man's face that was much younger than he imagined. The young man's expression was indifferent, and his black eyes seemed to be looking at the conference table in front of him, but also seemed to be looking down at him. "Who are you?" The old man suppressed the shock in his heart and said in a low voice. Hearing the old man's words, the clever young man next to him immediately scolded, "Bastard, give me your dirty hand. Who are you? How dare you trespass here? You want to die." As soon as he said the word die, his voice became distorted. He saw that his neck was strangled, and a bald, strong man wearing a mask flashed in from outside, carrying a huge black bag on his back. He strangled the young man's throat like he was holding a chick, and said in a low voice, "Kid, try saying what you said again." The young man's throat and windpipe were pressed down. His face was flushed and he couldn't breathe. At this moment, it was difficult for him to even make a sound, let alone speak smoothly. "Everyone, long time no see. Did you miss me?" Dean's voice was flat. There was no emotion in his voice. All 6 of them were members of the Dark Church. They had been through many battles with the Holy Church. How could they not see that the old man was under Dean's control? They were shocked. The seemingly ordinary old man had beheaded several great knights of the Holy Church. His body looked like a skeleton, but it contained terrifying power. But at the moment, he was so easily controlled by Dean. Thinking of the many possibilities that could lead to this person appearing here, everyone felt their scalps go numb. This was a person wanted by the chairman. Since this person dared to appear here, there was naturally a possibility that he could silence them. Elder, we all miss you very much." A bearded middle-aged man revealed a rather natural smile, but the stiff muscles on his face made the smile look somewhat forced. "Yes, Elder, we all miss you very much," another strong man immediately added. The calm old man's heart once again set off a huge wave as he heard the words of the 2 men. He didn't expect that this young man was the missing elder. Moreover, he dared to appear here. "I know that everyone misses me, so I came back." Dean's expression was indifferent and natural as he said, "I heard you mention about the elders' meeting. I seem to remember that half a year ago I promised that after 6 months I would make the 9th region one of the top 5 regions. I don't know if you still remember?" The old man was surprised. The 6 members of the council were also startled. They looked at each other. They naturally remembered these words, But after Dean's disappearance, they regarded these words as the latter's bragging and did not take it to heart. After all, they were used to this kind of thing. When they first took office, they promised a very high goal, and the purpose was just a means to win over people's hearts. After a long time in office, the foundation would be deep, and who would dare to mention the goal set at the beginning of taking office? Unless they didn't want to mix with the others. I always keep my word. I will personally participate in the elders' meeting, Dean calmly said. Sergei couldn't help but secretly curl his lips as he heard Dean's words. In his heart, Dean was definitely one of the most untrustworthy people. Dean was not a person who would talk about his reputation, but a person who wouldn't get up early if there was no profit. The six of them looked at Dean. After a while, the previous strong man cautiously said, "Elder, you are no longer an elder of the 9th region. The elders' meeting has always been attended by the elders. I'm afraid it doesn't matter." Dean indifferently said, "It may be so before me, but it may not be the same after me." The strong man was tongue-tied and couldn't speak. The old man was shocked as he heard Dean's words. He knew that Dean's strength was beyond that of a senior hunter. Perhaps his strength was comparable to the top few monsters in the outer wall. If Dean wanted to break into the elders' meeting, then the old man wouldn't be able to stop him. He quickly calculated in his mind, "I didn't expect you to be the previous elder. Nice to meet you." Yeah. Dean nodded slightly. This kind of attitude seemed a bit arrogant. The old man was unhappy, but he didn't show it. He continued, "Although you have abdicated, since you are still concerned about the 9th region, you can come with me." Dean patted the old man's shoulder. This action interrupted the old man's words. "Get up and talk to me." The old man's face turned ugly. He suppressed his anger. "I'm old, so it's not rude for me to sit down and talk to you." Hearing his words, all six of them were shocked, including the teenager. These words were tantamount to admitting that Dean was stronger than him. The weak needed to be respectful to the strong, but Dean was too young, so there was no need to salute, so it was not rude. "Don't talk to me about age," Dean said, "otherwise my grandson can be your grandfather." The old man was stunned. He didn't expect Dean to humiliate him so bluntly. He couldn't help but clench his fists. His heart was filled with anger. He gritted his teeth and slowly got up. "Since you want to sit, then sit." Dean pulled out a chair and sat at a comfortable distance away from the table. He leaned on the chair and crossed his legs. At this time, everyone suddenly saw the figure of the woman standing behind him. The latter's face was covered with a black scarf, but a pair of pure black pupils were exposed. Everyone felt a chill as they saw her eyes. It was as if they were being stared at by a pair of extremely ferocious eyes. "What is your name?" Dean asked the old man who was standing next to him. The old man was annoyed as he saw Dudian's attitude towards his subordinates. "My code name is Shooting Wolf." "Who recommended you to be an elder in the 9th region?" Dean looked into his eyes. "Was it the Pope or the elder of the monastery?" The old man's face changed as he heard the word Pope. The six people on both sides of the table were shocked as they had an instinctive sensitive response to the word. The old man's heart was pounding as he didn't expect Dean to expose his identity. He was indeed the Pope who had used the Holy Church's network to infiltrate the 9th region. He was the highest-level librarian of the Holy Church. Few people in the Holy Church had seen him for many years. It was because of this that the Pope had sent him. It was reasonable to say that no one would be able to see through his identity. He controlled his heartbeat and calmed down. "What Pope?" "I was personally appointed by the chairman." "Do you want to be an elder of the 9th region again? If so, then it's useless to slander me. You have to get the permission of the chairman to be an elder." Dean gently tapped the table. "Come with me to the Holy Church after the meeting. I've wanted to see the Pope for many years." The old man's face sank. "What nonsense are you talking about? Do you know who we are? Are you going to the Holy Church? Or are you going to betray the Holy Church? Are you going to ask for rewards from the hypocrites of the Church of Light? Dean said, There is only one word in your sentence that is correct. The old man frowned. What? Dean said, I'm going to ask for something. You. The old man's face was full of anger. I won't go with you unless you want to die, Dean said. The old man was silent as he felt the killing intent in Dean's words. He thought that his face project was in place. At least he had cleared the suspicion of being a spy. When you go to the Holy Church, prepare to die. He sneered in his heart. He could not wait for Dean to come to him. Dean didn't pay attention to the old man as he turned to look at the 6 people. He saw a familiar face. It was Amy who was imprisoned by him. He didn't expect that the great potion master would come out again. It seemed that the old man had put her in an important position. Dean didn't say anything. Since he was short of manpower at the moment, it would be useful for him to keep her. Amy's heart tightened when she saw Dean looking at her. She quickly lowered her head and didn't dare to look at him. She was afraid that Dean would hold a grudge against her and imprison her again in that dark, dirty dungeon. Everyone, I'll give you 3 days to rule all the branches. Move all the stored money, alchemy and potions to the headquarters. Dean's expression was calm but his words were shocking. Everyone was shocked. Gather all the resources to the headquarters? Is he going to rob the entire 9th region? Everyone looked at him in amazement. What is this person thinking? Is he crazy? Dean looked at Hawkeye who was next to him. You are responsible for this. Hawkeye looked at the boy that he hadn't seen for a long time. The familiar feeling in his heart came back again, but this time, he felt that the boy was a little different. First, his height had changed. He was taller than before. This was something that the animal glue mask couldn't change. In addition, he felt that the youth was more dangerous than before. There seemed to be a fierce soul hidden under the calm and indifferent face. Hawkeye understands. Hawkeye bowed. He would rather work under Dean than work under the old man Shootwolf. Although he was afraid of Dean, he had an indescribable sense of trust in him. Dean nodded. I'll come back on the day of the elders' meeting. Oh, by the way, I should be wanted by the higher-ups because of my disappearance. Everyone's heart skipped a beat as they heard Dean's words. Dean looked at everyone's reaction as he got the answer. I don't mind if you are interested. But don't affect the things I've told you. Otherwise you will have to bear the consequences. He turned and walked away. Aisha followed him like a shadow. Sergei let go of his hand and followed Dean. Everyone watched as the 3 of them left. When the sound of their footsteps faded away, everyone heaved a sigh of relief. Amy immediately said to Old Man Shooting Wolf, Elder, that scoundrel actually dared to appear again. We should immediately send someone to hunt him down. Old Man Shileng glanced at her. His gaze slowly swept across the faces of the others. He softly sighed, shook his head, and said, It is impossible to capture and kill this person by relying on the manpower of our 9th region. Amy was stunned. If my guess is correct, then his strength has exceeded the hunter level. He is enough to compete with the limitless of the inner wall. The old man slowly said. Everyone was surprised as they heard his words. They didn't expect Dean to be so strong. It was completely beyond their expectations. Amy gritted her teeth. We can use poison. If we can't beat him, then we can use sneak attacks, ambushes and assassinations. What's the use of strength? Will a strong person dare to swallow the poison I developed? The old man nodded. That's right. But we will leave this person to the other regions. We just need to spread the news about him. That's good. Amy was happy. Dean took Aisha and Sergei out of the town. They rode towards the direction of the castle that was given to them by the Temple of Elements. Master, is that the headquarters of the Dark Church? What do they mean by the 9th region? I think the people inside are extraordinary. Sergei couldn't suppress his curiosity as he asked Dean, Do you want to use the power of the Dark Church to fight? Dean replied, Yes. Chapter 605. There is danger in everything, Dean said in a flat tone, so sometimes you have to learn to take advantage of the danger. Sergei was startled. Most people were afraid of danger, so they would avoid danger. Smart people knew how to take precautions. However, the boy in front of him had learned to use danger as his weapon. It was hard to imagine that a boy who was less than 20 years old would have such a mind. He suddenly felt that the mysterious dark church was nothing in front of this boy. Although I don't know what he is thinking, but I hope that his plan won't fail, Sergei thought in his heart. Now he and Dean were in the same boat. Now he had provoked a force like the dark church. This was not a force that a single aristocrat could match. He couldn't imagine how many lives would be affected if Dean failed. He couldn't imagine how many people around Dean would die without a complete corpse. The night was blurred. Both of them avoided the checkpoints as they moved on the suburban road. They could see the streets were brightly lit. The beautiful nightlife had just begun. Dean pulled the rope of the horse. Aisha sat in front of him and leaned on his arms. Their chests and backs were touching, but the body temperature from Aisha's back was always cold. He felt that Aisha was restless in his arms. This restlessness had been accompanying her ever since they came out from the dark church. He was worried as he whispered in her ear, "Bear with it. After a few days, I'll let you have a good meal." Aisha's restless reaction became more obvious when she heard his words. Her tightly closed red lips slightly opened, revealing 2 sharp teeth. Dean silently looked at her face. He shook the reins of the horse and sped up. Aisha's restlessness gradually calmed down as they reached the Mosa River. Dean was relieved as he looked up. He pulled the reins of the horse and pointed to a place. "Who are those people?" Sergei rushed behind Dean and saw that there were soldiers patrolling the area. He was angry. "Master, don't be angry. This is the work of the military." 2 months ago the military had sent people to guard the area. They said that there were evil thieves coming and going. But they didn't go anywhere. They just stayed here and monitored us. Dean understood. No wonder he saw the patrolling soldiers before the curfew time. He asked, "Did you provoke the military?" Sergei replied, "I'm angry because I didn't provoke them. You donated a set of legendary items to the military for free when the barbarians invaded. It helped them to repel the enemy and establish their prestige. Now that you are gone, they turned around and tried to bite back. They are worse than me." Dean's eyes lit up as he sensed a trace of something else. He immediately said, "Abandon the horse and sneak back." "Okay." Sergei dismounted without hesitation. Dean dismounted with Aisha in his arms. They sneaked along the other side of the slope of the Mosa River. He used his thermal vision to scan the surroundings but didn't see any hidden sentries. It seemed that the surveillance here was relatively loose and no masters were sent over. Knowing this, he was puzzled. Soon, he sneaked back into the castle. With a sweep of his gaze, he saw a few familiar heat sources in the castle. He immediately jumped over the courtyard outside the manor and jumped into the garden lawn. Sergei followed Dean into the garden. He stood up from the grass and said, "Master, there is no surveillance in the yard." "We can." Dean stretched out his hand to stop him and pointed to the ground. Sergei looked down and saw a green line in the grass where his feet landed. He couldn't help but retract his feet and scratched his head. "They are too careful. They even set up a trap in their own yard." Dean didn't say anything. He crossed the line and went straight forward. Sergei immediately followed behind him and followed his footstep. Glenn was leaning on the sofa in the living room. She was bored and yawning. She was thinking about how to torture the disobedient mercenaries tomorrow. Suddenly she heard a noise from outside. She was surprised. She left the sofa and put on her boot. She appeared at the entrance of the manor. She looked to the left side where the noise came from. She saw a sturdy figure walking in the night. Glenn was relieved after she saw his appearance. "Sergei, how come you are back? Didn't the young master ask you to go outside the giant wall?" Sergei shrugged. I came back with the young master. Young master also came back? Glenn was surprised. I haven't seen you for a long time. A calm voice sounded from behind Glenn. Glenn was scared. She felt the hair on her body stand up. She jumped back and saw a teenager standing behind her. His hair was a little white. His face was familiar but also a bit strange. What surprised her the most was that the teenager's left hand was wrapped in a few pieces of cloth. But there were still a few frozen ice thorns protruding out. It seemed as if they were growing on his arm. Is it really you? Glenn quickly recovered and said, Are you okay? She was in a hurry to take a step forward when she felt a chill coming from behind him. She looked behind Dean, only to see a slender figure standing there with his face covered, like a ghost. Dean nodded and went into the living room. He sat down on the sofa and held Aisha's hand. He pulled her to sit on the sofa. He looked at Glenn. Call them down. I have something to say. Got it. Glenn's eyes were still on Aisha's body. She frowned as she saw Dean holding her hand intimately. Then she turned and went upstairs. After a moment, sounds of rapid footsteps came from upstairs. Is the young master back? Really? I saw it. It's true. The first one to appear in front of Dean was Nicholas. Although the old man's waist was stooped, but his movements were like the wind. Mason, Zack, Gabriel, and Hecate were behind him. Young master, you're finally back. Nicholas wasn't wearing any shoes, and his face was full of excitement as he watched him run down the stairs. Dean looked at Noyce's bare feet and nodded to him. He looked at Noyce. Are you okay? Noyce's eyes were wet as he heard Dean's words. He knew the reason behind Dean's greeting. His days were getting worse since Dean disappeared from the dark church. He accidentally overheard the conversation between Hawkeye and a head knight. He knew that Dean was wanted by the higher-ups. He was shocked at that time. He took advantage of the fact that the team prepared by the head commander hadn't come to capture him. He escaped from the dark church that night and sneaked back to the castle. Now that he had restored his identity as Noyce and was hiding in the castle, he wasn't found by the dark church. But these days were somewhat dull and painful. Moreover, he was on tenterhooks every day. He knew that once he fell into the hands of the dark church, his life would be worse than death. Compared to that, Thornflower Prison could be regarded as heaven. I'm fine, Noyce said. Young master, are you okay? You can't go back to the dark church. You are wanted by them. They will arrest you once you go back. It is said that the Dark Parliament has issued this order personally. The Dark Church in the 12 districts will arrest you, Sergei smiled bitterly. You're too late. Noyce was puzzled as he looked at Sergei. Do you know where we came from? Sergei smiled. Have you been there? Noyce's eyes widened. He suddenly thought of something and heaved a sigh of relief. Fortunately, you weren't discovered, otherwise, Sergei sighed and said, not only did I go there, I also followed the young master into the headquarters conference room. At that time, there were several people who looked like important people in the meeting. Noyce was dumbfounded and speechless. Dean didn't let them continue to waste time talking. He indifferently said, I remember that I had given you a task 6 months ago. Does anyone remember our purpose 6 months ago? Nicholas' eyelids twitched. Master, you told us to complete our tasks and wait for the opportunity. Are you coming back to? Dean nodded. Yes, I'm ready to unify the outer wall in half a month. All the consortiums and forces will have one name and one master. Glenn, Nicholas, Noyce and others were stunned as they heard his words. Dean didn't give them any buffer time. Everything is ready for this expedition. Don't worry, as this is just an appetizer. You just need to improve your strength every day for the next half a month. Tomorrow I will bring a batch of God's marrows, which will help senior hunters to break through their limits. But before that you must reach the limit of senior hunters. Everyone looked at him in a daze. Gwyneth's silent expression changed as she heard the words God's marrows. She stared at Dean as she quietly clenched her fists. Dean noticed Gwyneth's eyes. Gwyneth, It won't be long before you will be able to accomplish what you always wanted to do." Everyone's eyes looked at Gwyneth. They knew from Sergei that the girl's wish was to return to the inner wall and take revenge on the people who had framed her. "Thank you, young master." Gwyneth slightly lowered her head as she bit her lips. She knew that Dean wasn't the boy she knew when they first met. Although God's marrow wasn't a top secret, but only people who had reached a certain level had the right to know about it. Dean nodded slightly as he thought of the patrolling guards outside. "What's going on with the guards stationed outside? You already know about it?" Glenn was startled. She didn't expect Dean to notice it as soon as he came back. She hesitated for a moment. "According to the information I've gathered, it seems that the soldiers are monitoring us. Is it related to the Mel family?" "Mel family?" Dean narrowed his eyes. Glenn said, "The superiors of the soldiers are former subordinates of the Mel family. Moreover, the Mel family has moved to the western part of the commercial district and settled down there. It seems that they are ready to restart their development. It's because I'm not here that they are reviving." Dudian nodded as a cold light flashed in his eyes. Nicotine suddenly said, "Young master, I am guilty, please punish me." Finished speaking, he immediately bowed down. Dean frowned. "Speak." Nicotine said bitterly, "Young master, I'm afraid it will be difficult for me to complete the task you gave me before. I have cultivated the mulberry leaves and other plants you asked me to cultivate, but 2 months ago, my plantation was forcefully bought by a group of people. The local land management department actually approved it, so the things you asked me to cultivate are now gone." Dean's eyes flashed. "Did the Mel family do it?" Nicholas felt Dudien's anger and nervously replied, "Master, I have checked and it is indeed related to the Mel family." Dean coldly looked at him. "Didn't you ask old Foulin for help?" Cold sweat overflowed from Nicotine's back. "Master, I did, but old Foulin was ill and refused to visit. I couldn't." Dean's face sank, and his eyes were as gloomy as water. "Are you really sick, or are you making an excuse to not see me?" Nicotine replied, "He's really sick. I've checked, and the doctor who treated old Foulin said that old Foulin was infected with black spots. He won't live for long." The killing intent in Dean's eyes dissipated a lot. He nodded and said, "You are indeed guilty." Nicotine's heart skipped a beat, and he hurriedly knelt down. "Please punish me, young master. Since you've already done your best, I'll give you a chance to redeem yourself." Dean indifferently said, "I'm asking you, are the plants still there after the land was sold?" "Yes." Nicholas busily said, "Mel family doesn't know what those things are for. But looking at such a large area of planting, they think that there is a way. So they didn't destroy them. Instead, they continued to plant them. All the workers I hired at that time stayed." "That's good." Dean breathed a sigh of relief. "In that case, now you gather people and take back that place. Now?" Nicotine was stunned. Chapter 606. Nicotine's scalp tightened as he saw Dudien's anger. "Master, it's not difficult to take back the cultivation base. But we can't deal with the Mel family. Unless you can restore your previous identity, the Mel family can use a little bit of their connections to arrest us on the charge of seizing the land. In my opinion, Mel family is worried that they won't be able to punish us. If we forcibly seize the base at this time, then most of us will be caught by them." Mason was angry as he heard his words. "Seizing the land? It's obvious that they robbed us. How dare they complain?" Nicholas tilted his head to look at him and sighed. "This kind of thing, isn't it normal?" Macon was even more angry. "It's because you think so you condone this kind of thing." Nicotine was speechless. He wanted to refute but felt that there was some truth in Mason's words. He couldn't help but sigh. Dean's finger gently touched the leather armrest of the sofa. "You can handle this matter. Mel family won't intervene in this matter." Nicholas was slightly taken aback, looking at him suspiciously. "Won't interfere? Why? Are you going to come out personally? It's a bit inappropriate. You don't have the identity of the master of the temple, so the Mel family won't make a concession so easily. I have my own way. Dean waved his hand. You don't have to worry about it. Nicotine felt strange as he looked at Dean. He saw that the boy was very calm and seemed to have a plan. He was curious in his heart. He had tried all the ways he could think of, but there was no way to solve this matter. Dean and Mel family were mortal enemies. Even if there were great benefits, it would be difficult to stop the Mel family. After all, no one would sit back and wait for the enemy to grow up and annihilate them. However, since Dean had said so, he could only do as he was told. Dean indifferently said after Nicholas left, Glenn, Sergei, Gwyneth, the three of you come with me. The three of them were startled but immediately obeyed. Dean looked at Noyce. You stay en garde. Yes, young master. Noyce nodded respectfully. Dean immediately got up and stepped out of the castle. Aisha followed him like a shadow. Young master, this is? Glenn couldn't help but ask as she saw Aisha following closely behind Dean. There was an inexplicable feeling of panic in her heart. Dudian indifferently said, You don't have to know and don't care. Just don't get close to her. Although she is very gentle, but she hates strangers. If you get close to her, be careful of losing your life. The three of them were startled. Did Dean's words mean that the girl had the ability to kill them? Although they felt that the girl was extraordinary, but they knew that they were at the top of the outer wall. There were many people who could defeat them, but there were only a few who could kill them. Gwyneth stared at the back of the mysterious girl for a while. She felt that she had seen this girl before, but she couldn't remember where. She quickly recovered her thoughts and asked Dudian, Where are we going now? Mel family. Dudian said. The three of them were stunned. Dean came out of the castle and walked along the Tiza River. Sergei was about to remind Dean to avoid the surveillance of the soldiers. However, he saw that Dean was heading towards the location of the soldiers. His heart skipped a beat as he faintly guessed something. Dean took the lead and came to the barracks across the river. 7 or 8 soldiers were barbecuing, eating and drinking around the campfire. There were several empty beer barrels on the ground. Boy, go away. This isn't a place you can come to. One of the patrolling soldiers shouted at Dudian. He was nervous as he had noticed Dudian leaving the castle. Especially Sergei, Glenn and the others. He was very familiar with them. He didn't know why they were here in the middle of the night. Dean raised his hand and said in a cold voice, Kill! The three of them were startled but quickly reacted. Gwyneth was the first to understand Dean's meaning. She took the lead and rushed out. She turned the dagger in her hand and pierced the neck of the soldier who shouted at Dean. The soldier was just an ordinary soldier. He was killed before he could react. Sergei and Glenn acted quickly. In the blink of an eye, all the soldiers who were resting by the fire or sleeping in the tents were killed by the three of them. None of them were left alive. The three of them came back to Dean after killing all the soldiers. Glenn's face was ugly as she looked at Dean. Master, I'm afraid that the military won't give up after we killed them. I'm the one who won't give up. Dean's eyes were cold. He was about to turn around and leave when he felt a burst of restlessness and killing intent coming from behind. He quickly turned around to avoid it. Whoosh! A gust of cold wind rushed out and pounced on the body of a soldier on the ground. It was Aisha who was following behind Dean. This shocking scene made Sergei and the other two completely stunned. When they saw Aisha biting the soldier's neck, the three widened their eyes and looked at this scene incredulously. Dean's face changed. There was a trace of heartache and anger in his eyes. He stepped forward and grabbed Aisha's shoulder to stop her from biting. Don't be like this. You don't deserve to touch such garbage. You have to endure it. He snapped his fingers twice. Aisha stopped biting as she heard the snapping sound. Her mouth twitched and her body seemed to be trembling. Dudian knew that she was trying her best to endure. He kicked away the soldier's body in her arms and picked her up. He turned and left. He put Aisha on the ground when he reached the open space far away from the soldier's body. Aisha seemed to have calmed down and wasn't as restless as before. Dean was relieved. He turned to look at Glenn and the other two. He frowned as he saw the shocked look on their faces. It's best not to leak out what you saw here. Sergei came back to his senses and quickly nodded to keep his mouth shut. He finally understood why he felt palpitations from the girl. She was by no means an ordinary girl. Chapter 607. Glenn, Gwyneth and Sergei subconsciously stayed a few meters behind Dean as they saw the scene of Aisha eating the corpses of the soldiers. They didn't dare to get too close to Aisha. They had seen countless ferocious people, but they had never seen such a bloodthirsty and cruel person. From the previous scene, it seemed that even Dean might not be able to completely suppress the girl. The three of them kept silent as if nothing had happened. Dean stopped and looked at Glenn. How many mercenaries have you gathered? Glenn didn't know why Dudian was asking this question, but she truthfully reported. Due to the fear of attracting the attention of the military and other forces, we have been secretly recruiting in the last 6 months. The number of mercenaries is not much. There are nearly 8,000 ordinary mercenaries, 70 primary hunters, 7 intermediate hunters, 2 senior hunters. Dean didn't wait for her to finish. I'll give you half an hour to gather them at the square. Glenn was startled. Master, I'm afraid that half an hour. Don't gather them all. Gather as many as you can. Yes. Glenn was relieved. She looked at Dean. Should I go? Dean nodded. Glenn immediately excused herself and turned around, her figure disappearing into the night. Dean took Sergei and Gwyneth to the rendezvous point after Glenn left. Half an hour passed. By the time Dean and others arrived at the square, thousands of figures had gathered in the relatively remote square. They were standing scattered in the square and whispering to each other. Dean frowned as he saw the noisy scene. Is this your management? Gwyneth, who was standing next to Sergei, knew that Dean was talking to her. She slowly stepped forward. I'll reorganize. She saw that Dean didn't respond. It seemed that he acquiesced. She left and came to the front of the square. Her clear voice spread through the audience. Silence. Hundreds of people in front of the square heard Gwyneth's voice and immediately stopped their discussion and became quiet. The people further behind were still whispering, but soon they noticed something strange in front of them, so they gradually stopped talking and stood on tiptoe to look ahead. Greetings, Head Gwyneth. 3 figures came out of the crowd and respectfully said to Gwyneth. Gwyneth said in a cold voice, Order everyone to line up and wait for orders. The 3 respectfully replied, Yes. He turned around and returned to the crowd. A moment later, a dozen or so figures flashed through the crowd. The originally loose crowd was led by these dozen or so people, and one after another, they formed a huge square. At this time, footsteps came from outside the square. It was Glenn who was leading a team of hundreds of people. The originally noisy square instantly quieted down. The passers-by who saw such a scene immediately moved away in fright, not daring to approach. Gwyneth quickly returned to Dean. Master, the reorganization is complete. We are waiting for your command, Dean said. Pass the order on my behalf. Everyone will follow us to battle. Tonight we will wash the Mel family with blood. Gwyneth's heart skipped a beat. She didn't dare to neglect and immediately replied, Yes. Sergei's face slightly changed as he heard Dean's words. It was obvious that this wasn't a simple demonstration. Tonight there would be a storm of blood which would alarm the entire outer wall. There was a trace of worry in his heart. It wouldn't be difficult to capture the Mel family with their strength. But the real trouble would be after the capture. After all, the Mel family was an ancient aristocratic family with a wide network in the outer wall. Whether it was the army or the Holy Church, there were members of the family who held high power. As long as they instigated the other forces to attack the Mel family. Sergei looked at Dean's back. He wanted to say something but hesitated. But then he thought that the youth was different from him. Although he was young and frivolous, but he was more patient and cunning than an 80-year-old fox. He wasn't an impulsive person. Sergei's heart slowly calmed down as he thought of this. Gwyneth returned to the front of the square as Sergei was lost in his thoughts. Everyone! Tonight I will massacre the Mel family. We will go to war immediately. Sergei's voice was clear and loud. The passers-by in the distance heard her voice and ran away in fright. All the mercenaries were stunned, but they quickly became excited. They shouted in unison, and their auras were strong. Glenn returned to Dean's side. Master, time is pressing. I can only gather these people. I don't know if it's enough. It's enough, Dean said. Inform Gwyneth and let her lead the team to follow us. We will go first. Glenn was startled. You want to go first? Dean didn't answer as he turned and left. Sergei was startled but immediately followed behind him. Crowtown. Mel family. Crowtown was famous for its seafood in the western part of the commercial district. There was a famous lake called Blue Lake. The Blue Lake was wide and clear. There were many delicious and rare fish in it. The people who lived in this town had been fishing for generations. Fishing skills had been passed down for hundreds of years. There was a saying that the people of Crowtown could swim if they could walk. This saying described the innate ability of the people of Crowtown to swim. There were three most conspicuous buildings in the center of the town. The first one was the praying church of the Holy Church. The second one was the castle of the Victor family. The third one was the newly built castle of the Mel family. Few people knew that the Victor family and the Mel family were distant relatives. The ancestors of the Victor family had intermarried. But later on, the Victor family declined and the Mel family severed their relationship. Now the two families were united again. Miss Shaya, the tuna in our Blue Lake salt pond will be in harvest season in 3 months. According to the previous income, we can get at least 100,000 gold coins this year. We can use these 100,000 gold coins to recruit soldiers and train hunters. It will be enough to help you make a comeback. A middle-aged man wearing a black suit said, while sitting at the other end of the table. He was sitting at the other end of the table. The table was very long. It was 6 meters long. Fortunately, the hall was extremely quiet so that his voice could reach the other end of the table. Sarah smiled and raised her glass. My grandfather and father won't forget your kindness. In the future, when the Mel family returns to the inner wall, we will bring your Victor family. The middle-aged man's eyes lit up. He immediately raised his cup and said with a smile, Miss Saya, you're being too polite. Your father has given birth to such a beautiful and intelligent daughter. It's really enviable. Come. The wine glass was slightly lifted. Although it was 6 meters away, the level of the glass was accurately controlled under the mouth of Sarah's glass. Sarah Mel indifferently smiled and said, When I was young, my grandfather often said that he would take me to Wu Gang Town. He said that the scenery here is beautiful and the seafood is delicious. It's the most suitable place to live and retire. Now that I finally have the opportunity to come here, seeing is believing. I heard that Blackport Town had reached an agreement with the military many years ago to cancel the conscription in Blackport. Mr. James is indeed a wise landlord. James chuckled and said, Not at all. This is all done by my father. The old man has already retired, and he has been feeling unwell recently. He has been talking about visiting old Mr. George, but it's a pity that the journey is long and he has a chronic illness. It's really a pity. There will be opportunities in the future. Sarah Mel smiled. Mr. James, your family has been managing this town for generations and has won the hearts of the people. Why don't you go a step further and rent the passage and apply for military power? James shook his head and sighed. I think so too. But my father is too stubborn. He wants to stay in this town and enjoy his old age. I can't do anything about it. But if I can go back to the inner wall, then I will have fulfilled my father's wish for many years. Sarah nodded. It's my father's wish to return to the inner wall. In the past, our Mel family and your Victor family were expelled from the inner wall because they violated the rules. So many years have passed. My grandfather, My father and my grandfather's wish is to return to the inner wall and get the title of nobility." There was a trace of indignation in her voice. "The Mellon Consortium, which was run by our family, has found an opportunity to return to the inner wall. But that damned despicable person framed our family and caused us to go bankrupt. Otherwise our Mell family and Mr. James would have returned to the inner wall." James quietly looked at her and smiled. "There will always be opportunities. Miss Sarah doesn't need to be angry. It's getting late, so I'll take my leave first. We'll talk tomorrow." Sarah immediately put away the indignation on her face. "I'll see you off. Miss Sarah is too polite." James got up and left. He was accompanied by Sarah as they left the Mell family's castle. They returned to the neighboring castle of the Victor family. Looking at James' figure disappearing into the night, Sarah's innocent smile immediately disappeared. Her eyes were cold. "Damn thing. A mere 100,000 gold coins and he wants to board the ship?" In his dreams. "Miss, is the Victor family still willing to pay 100,000 gold coins?" A short-haired maid frowned. Sarah coldly replied, "That village fisherman is short-sighted. Now our Mell family is in trouble. If he really wants to help, then we will remember his kindness." "Humph! A mere 100,000 gold coins, and he wants to ask for a favor. If it wasn't for the fact that our industry hasn't been unsealed, then I wouldn't even bother to accept such a small amount of money." "Miss is right," the maid respectfully replied. Sarah retracted her gaze and looked at her. The coldness in her eyes suddenly disappeared. There was a trace of tenderness in her eyes. "Lisa, you're the only one who won't leave me." "No matter what happens, I won't leave Mississippi," Lisa whispered. Sarah Mell smiled and took her hand. "Let's go inside." "Yes, Mississippi," Lisa nodded. Both of them went back to the room on the second floor. The servants who saw them respectfully bowed their heads and stared at their toes. They didn't dare to peek. Sarah took Lisa into the room and immediately closed the door. She was about to turn around when suddenly an indifferent voice echoed from the room. "I didn't expect that the wise and arrogant Miss Mell is actually a lesbian." Sarah Mell turned around and angrily said, "Who is it?" As soon as the words left his mouth, he saw 3 figures on the sofa in the main hall of the room. 2 of them were standing, and 1 of them was sitting. The person who was sitting had his legs crossed and was leaning on the sofa in an extremely comfortable position. He had a head of black hair and an icy expression. There was not a hint of a smile on his face, but his indifferent eyes seemed to constantly reveal a hint of ridicule. After Sarah saw the man's face, the anger on her face faded like a tide. Her pink cheeks instantly turned pale. Her hands trembled as she slowly moved to her back. She regretted closing the door so eagerly. "Bring it over," Dean indifferently said as he saw Sarah's small movements. Carl, who was standing on the side, grinned. His figure flashed and appeared in front of the 2. Just as he was about to grab Sarah, suddenly a palm attack came. It was Lisa. Her speed was incomparably fast. She wasn't an ordinary maid. He was slightly surprised. He saw that Sarah had quickly grabbed the handle of the door. She was ready to open the door and call for help. He suddenly felt annoyed. He punched Lisa's palm. Lisa's soft palm pressed against Lisa's chest. Her body hit the door. He took the opportunity to quickly pinch Sarah and Lisa's shoulders. He brought them in front of Dean. Sarah covered her shoulder and screamed in pain. Lisa hurried to support her. "Miss, are you okay?" Sarah bit her lips and stared at Dean in anger. "Why are you here? What do you want to do?" "I'm telling you that this is the Black Harbor town. It's a town under the protection of the military. If you kill me, then the military and the Holy Church will investigate this matter. Our Mell family is in dire straits, but we are still a noble family. Not everyone can invade us." "Invade?" There was a trace of malice in Dean's indifferent eyes. He looked at Sergei. "Don't you like beauties? Do you like this beauty?" Sergei looked at Sarah and shook his head. "I don't like a snake or a scorpion. I'm not asking you to marry her. I'm asking you to have sex with her." Dean snapped. Sergei scratched his head. That's not a problem. No. Lisa suddenly got up and looked at Dean. Even if I die, I won't let you hurt Mississippi. Dean looked at her familiar face. The killing intent in his eyes became stronger. I haven't seen you for a long time, Lisa. Have you forgotten me? Lisa coldly replied, Of course I won't forget. We are both from the Maitian orphanage. Let us go if you remember the old affection. I'll promise you anything as long as you let go of Miss. No. Sarah flatly said. Dean indifferently said, Remember the old affection? You wanted to harm me when I was adopted. You said that I was mute and wanted to take away the adopter. Now it seems that your wish has come true. I didn't expect that after all these years, you would climb to the position of the famous Miss of Mel family from an orphan adopted by a gardener. Sure enough, I didn't misjudge you at that time. You always have a good future if you have a bad heart. Lisa's face turned ugly. You should know that it's all about ability to be adopted. Yes. Dean nodded. I agree. So if you want to live, it's all about ability. You. Lisa clenched her teeth in anger. Dean got up and said, Let's tie them up first. We'll give the beautiful Miss Sarah a surprise. Sarah's eyes widened in horror. What are you going to do? Are you crazy? We are nobles. Chapter 608. Sarah bit her lips. Indeed, the Mel family was one of the ancient aristocrats in the commercial district. But, like other aristocrats in the commercial district, they weren't conferred the title of nobility. Their status in the household register was just aristocrat. Sarah felt a sense of shame as she looked at the contempt in Dean's indifferent eyes. She gritted her teeth. Even if we aren't conferred the title of nobility, we are still aristocrats. Once we return to the inner wall, we will be conferred the title of nobility. If other aristocrats know that you have treated us like this, then they will jointly put you on the wanted list. If you leave now, then I will act as if nothing has happened. I promise you in the name of the Mel family. Dean sneered. Aristocrat? It's just a dog of a real aristocrat. Do you want to know who your grandfather is? I'll tell you after we finish our business. After saying that, he stepped between the two of them and left without looking back. Sarah was startled. She looked back at Dean. Her beautiful cheeks were twisted in anger as she screamed, Untouchable! You slum untouchable! Bang! Sergei quickly made a move and knocked her out with a karate chop, and then turned his hand to the maid Lisa. Lisa hurriedly raised her hand to block, but this time Sergei was prepared. He easily avoided her attack and chopped her neck. She immediately fainted. You stay here and look after them. Dean opened the door and threw out a sentence. Sergei was startled. Don't you need my help? Dean didn't answer as he went out of the door. The maid outside the corridor saw Dean come out of the room. She was stunned for a moment and immediately shouted at him. Dean gently rubbed and snapped his fingers. Aisha's expressionless face suddenly woke up. Her deep and emotionless eyes shot out two bloodthirsty rays of light. She suddenly flew out. In an instant, mournful screams rang out from the corridor and echoed back to the room with its slightly open door. When Sergei heard the scream of fear, he suddenly felt a chill spread throughout his body. It was as if there were evil spirits coming out of the slightly open door, turning the world into purgatory. Blood splashed on the walls on both sides of the corridor. Dean walked quietly, leaving behind the bodies of the maids. At the same time, a figure covered in blood followed behind Dean. The two of them walked down the bloody corridor step by step. Their alloy boots stepped on the wooden stairs, making creaking sounds. The screams on the second floor had already agitated the guards in the castle. When Dean came to the stairs, more than a dozen figures wearing knight armors engraved with the Mel family's emblem rushed into the hall on the first floor. They were holding spears and swords. They looked up the stairs and saw the unfamiliar face of Dean. At the same time, they also saw the back of Dean's hair was somewhat messy, and his chin was dripping with blood. The knights were stunned for a moment before they immediately charged forward. One of them recognized Dean and exclaimed out loud, "Whoosh!" Aisha didn't wait for the knights to rush to the stairs as she smelled the smell of blood. She was like a purple phantom as she instantly rushed into the team of knights and tore a gap. She moved like lightning, her sharp nails easily piercing through the hard armors of the knights, like a wolf in a flock of sheep. In an instant 4 or 5 knights were sent flying, and the other 2 knights were caught in her hands. They struggled in horror, but were unable to break free. Dean noticed that although Aisha had the same bloodthirsty characteristics as the undead, but there was a big difference in her attacks. She knew how to avoid the sharp spearhead of the knight's spear. His heart skipped a beat. Could it be that she still retained part of her consciousness as a human? This discovery made him a little excited. He felt that this was the biggest surprise of the night. Soon, the knights who rushed into the hall were killed by Aisha. The undead's attack pattern was to attack living creatures first instead of catching them and biting them. When the knights were slaughtered, Aisha's bloodthirsty eyes suddenly turned to the maids, housekeepers, maids and other servants in the hall. These people had long been scared to the point that their legs were soft. They trembled and stayed in the same place. Seeing Aisha rush over, these people seemed to forget to escape. They just stood in the same place and looked at her pleadingly. Fear was engraved in their eyes. Tears flowed down their cheeks, but there was no sound of crying. Aisha's ferocious face was reflected in the eyes of these people. She didn't show the slightest mercy. She cut off the head, pierced through the chest, or twisted the head off. Her attacks were all fatal. She was extremely bloody and brutal. Dean saw this scene. He didn't feel that it was too bloody. Instead, his eyes lit up. He noticed that Aisha's attack pattern was different from ordinary undead. She was like a veteran hunter who clearly knew the flaws and weaknesses of the prey. Maybe there is hope for her consciousness to recover. His mind was full of such thoughts. His eyes were full of hope. He only felt that the screams of fear in his ears had become particularly pleasant. "What's the matter?" Meanwhile, a middle-aged man that wore a hunter armor flashed over swiftly from outside the hall, and he'd just arrived at the hall when he spoke in a loud voice. He'd only spoken halfway when he clearly noticed the scene within the hall. Internal organs were scattered all over the ground while blood flowed into rivers, and it was like a bloody hell. He was stunned. In the next moment, he felt a chill coming from his left side. He turned his head stiffly and immediately saw an excited and ferocious beautiful face. His pupils rapidly widened. Puff! His head was immediately sent flying, and thick blood gushed out from his neck like a fountain. His body fell straight down. Dean glanced at the middle-aged man's armor. It turned out to be a senior hunter. He didn't expect that the Mel family that he had defeated could not only recover in such a short time, but also win over a senior hunter. After killing the middle-aged man, Aisha suddenly smelled something and immediately rushed out of the hall. Dean immediately jumped down the stairs and quickly followed. As soon as he got out of the hall, Dean heard a burst of neat footsteps and the sound of armors rubbing. Soon, a group of knights and squires rushed out of the building in the left corner of the castle outside the hall. These people just came out of the left corner of the castle. Aisha took the initiative to greet them. The bloody massacre immediately reappeared, and blood-curdling screams rang out continuously. Chapter 609. Dean waited for Aisha to finish killing the knight. He used the metal stick in his arms to hit the ground. The sound caught Aisha's attention. Her beautiful face was full of ferociousness as she rushed towards Dean. Dean raised his hand and pointed to the front. Aisha looked at the direction of Dean's hand. She revealed a bloodthirsty killing intent once again. She rushed towards the castle with the Mel family's flag. "Who is it? Not good!" screams and screams echoed. The knights who were guarding outside the castle were powerless in front of Aisha. Since Aisha had adapted to the Tomane, her strength had returned to its original peak state. Moreover, because of the undead transformation, she would never be affected by physical consumption or injuries. Soon, Aisha killed the knights and crashed into the castle. Screams and screams echoed from inside the castle. Dean stood outside the castle and looked up. His eyes narrowed as he jumped to the window on the second floor. He grabbed the rough rock and jumped to the balcony on the third floor. Several people in the room noticed the movement on the balcony and rushed over. When the curtain covering the balcony was lifted by a few people, a leg kicked out from the middle. A refined young man standing in the middle was immediately sent flying. His chest caved in, and he spat out a mouthful of blood. He died on the spot. Several people wearing knights' armors were aghast as they saw the scene. Although they had weapons in their hands, they didn't dare to attack. The youth who was kicked wasn't an ordinary person. He was a knight from the Holy Church who was invited by the Mel family. Who would have thought that such a person wouldn't be able to react and would be kicked to death by Dean on the spot? Dean walked into the room. He looked indifferent as he glanced at the bed in the room. He saw a haggard and pale middle-aged man lying on the bed. He was the current head of the Mel family, Mark. This business legend who once stirred up the business district was now lying here, with two doctors in white coats standing next to him, and a priest holding a Bible blessing chapter in his hand. Everyone in the room was shocked as they looked at the motionless youth on the ground. It was hard to imagine that there would be such a person in the outer wall. He could kill a knight of the Holy Church at such a young age. Moreover, it was a one-hit kill. The room was deathly silent. Suddenly, the miserable screams from downstairs reached everyone's ears. Everyone's faces grew unsightly. They knew that the person who had attacked them in the night was not alone. Who are you? This is the territory of the Mel family. A middle-aged knight bravely stopped in front of Dean and said. Dean indifferently looked at him and waved his hand. In the eyes of the middle-aged knight, Dean's hand was like a shadow. It was difficult for him to react. He raised his weapon to block. Bang! His hand hit the weapon. The middle-aged knight felt as if his weapon was hit by a hammer. The strong force made his hands numb. He retreated a few steps and almost fell down. Dean waved his hand to repel the man, but did not look at him. Instead, he walked step by step towards the bed. The two doctors and the priest who were standing next to the bed trembled and retreated to the side. The priest was an older man, perhaps in his 60s. His hand trembled, and the book in his hand fell to the ground with a thud. Everyone else in the room was shocked, and their hearts began to pound. The priest's face turned pale. He didn't know whether to retreat or to pick up the book. Dean went straight to the bed and slowly sat down. He looked at the unconscious Mark. He raised his hand and patted Mark's sparse cheek. "Wake up." Mark woke up in a daze. He struggled to open his eyes. He saw a familiar face in front of him. Was it the youth? Am I still dreaming? Thinking this, he closed his eyes again. Dean patted Mark's face again. "Wake up." It was as if it was a normal thing to wake someone up. Mark frowned as he struggled to open his eyes. He saw the face in front of him again. He was a little annoyed. Suddenly, he saw the doctor and the other knight. He couldn't help but be startled. Was it a dream? He stared again, blinked, and finally saw the scene in the room clearly. He couldn't help but be stunned. "Patriarch, don't you recognize me?" Dean looked at him. Mark was alarmed. His complexion changed as he hurriedly turned his head to look around. He even forgot about the pain in his body. "Your baby daughter is still here," Dean slowly said. "Patriarch, don't be nervous. It's not good for your body. I'll have to trouble you to move to a place and come with me." Mark reacted. He looked at Dean. "What do you want to do? This is the Mel family. You dare to openly attack a noble? Do you want to be the enemy of everyone?" "So what if I have to be the enemy of everyone?" Dean calmly replied. Mark was startled. Dean turned to look at the two doctors. "What's wrong with Mr. Mel?" The two doctors heard the screams from downstairs. They were scared to death. They rushed to answer as they saw Dean looking at them. It's Nola disease. Is he going to die?" Dean asked. He needs to meditate and then cooperate with treatment to have a chance to live, Dean said. Both of you keep Mr. Mel's life. If something happens to Mr. Mel, then you will be buried with him. Do you understand? Both of them were in cold sweat. They nodded like chickens pecking rice. Bang! At this time, the door was knocked open. The smell of blood poured into the room. There was a bloody figure standing in the doorway. He looked like a devil from hell. The incessant screams outside also disappeared at this moment. Everyone in the room stepped back in fear. They looked at the bloody figure in horror. Dean stood up and stood in front of the two doctors. Whoosh! Aisha roared as she rushed towards the knights. In the blink of an eye, the knights were torn apart and killed by Aisha. Their internal organs and intestines were scattered on the ground. Blood splashed all over the exquisite decorations in the room. Dean snapped his fingers. Aisha's body stopped. Her shoulders slightly trembled as if she was trying to restrain herself. Dean looked at the two doctors. You wait here. Someone will pick you up soon. Don't worry, as I won't kill doctors. When the two doctors heard Dean's words, their hearts that were tightly gripped by fear were slightly relieved. But they were worried that Dean would not keep his words, so they were still very nervous. Dean walked towards Aisha. He held her cold and slender hand and walked out of the room step by step. He walked along the corridor, which was full of corpses. He left the castle and came to the gate of the Mel family's manor. He stood with Aisha in the night. He took out a handkerchief and wiped the blood stains on Aisha's cheek. Aisha was expressionless, but the corners of her mouth were still slightly curled, revealing a somewhat sinister expression. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance after Dean wiped the blood on her face. Gwyneth took the lead and rushed to this place at full speed. She was followed by a large group of people who occupied the spacious street. It was a majestic scene. Gwyneth was surprised when she saw Dean and Aisha waiting at the door. She sped up and saw Aisha, who was standing next to Dean. Aisha was covered in blood, especially her palms. The blood was still fresh and was slowly dripping down. Gwyneth's face changed as she remembered the scene of Aisha biting the corpses of the soldiers. There was a trace of inexplicable tension in her heart. She looked at Dean. Master, we are here. Dean indifferently said as he wiped his palms with a handkerchief. Almost all the masters inside are dead. Take some people to deal with the rest. Also call Sergei to bring the father and daughter of the Mel family. Gwyneth was startled. Her eyes couldn't help but look at the huge manor behind Dean. It was brightly lit, but it seemed particularly quiet. She could only hear faint sobbing sounds. She was shocked. This was a big aristocratic family. How could they be massacred by Dean alone? Did you hear me? Dean frowned as he saw that she didn't answer. Gwyneth responded, Yes, master. She thought of something and asked, What about the rest of the people? Chapter 6:10. Gwyneth hesitated for a moment before replying, Yes, young master. Then she turned around and waved her hand, leading the troops to rush into the manor. The group of over 1,000 people was like a black tide, surging into every corner of the manor. In an instant, screams and cries sounded from every corner of the manor, and the smell of blood quietly spread out. Only the night was silent. Sergei carried Sarah and Mel, who were unconscious, to the outside of the manor. Glenn escorted Mark and 2 doctors out of the manor. Mark wasn't in a coma. His body was tied to the bed and he couldn't struggle. When he was carried outside the manor, he suddenly saw Dean standing quietly in the night. His eyes were like fire, and his face was red with anger. He roared, You bastard, you should go to hell! Dean slowly turned around and indifferently looked at him. Mr. Mel, how does it feel to see your clansmen die? Damned beast! Mark angrily stared at him. You are not a human. You will be judged one day. You will never be able to wash away your sins. You deserve to die. Dean indifferently smiled. Who doesn't have a little sin in this world? God can't judge me, let alone a human. Mark clenched his fists in anger. His chest was in pain as he used too much force. He couldn't help but cough out blood. Dean indifferently said, "Take him away." "Yes." Glenn nodded. She called the 2 mercenaries who were carrying the bed to take Mark away. Gwyneth returned from the manor. She was followed by a team of mercenaries who were escorting a large number of people dressed as servants. Some of them were old, weak women and children. Gwyneth came in front of Dean. "Master, what should we do with these people?" Dean glanced at the people she escorted. "Didn't I say not to leave the remnants of the Mel family?" Gwyneth replied, "Master, these people aren't members of the Mel family. They are just hired servants. They are ordinary people." "Are you sure that they don't have feelings for the Mel family?" Dean indifferently looked at her. Gwyneth was stunned. "The master is dead. As a servant, shouldn't I be buried with my master?" Dudyan coldly said. Gwyneth bit her lip. She knew that Dudyan was determined to kill her. She turned around and made a beheading gesture. Some of the servants were sharp-eyed. They cried and begged as they heard Dean's words. They cursed the Mel family and wanted to disassociate themselves from the Mel family. When the mercenaries saw Gwyneth's gesture, they immediately pulled out their weapons. In an instant, the rest of the escorted servants panicked and fell to the ground, begging for mercy. Seeing this sad scene, Gwyneth couldn't help but close her eyes. Puff, puff, puff. The sound of metal blades cutting flesh was heard one after another. Blood spurted out and sputtered. Some of the people who were close enough to Gwyneth's smooth cheeks had a trace of heat. She slowly opened her eyes and saw that the servants in front of her were beheaded one after another. Blood flowed like a river and heads were everywhere. The rest of the servants were desperately crying and begging for mercy. Soon, all the pleading voices disappeared, and the ground was littered with corpses and the cries of babies. Gwyneth quickly went over to the corpses of the servants and ordered people to pick them up. She turned around and brought them back to Dean. She was about to speak when she heard Dean's indifferent voice. "What do you want to say?" Gwyneth couldn't help but say, "Master, these children are innocent. Can you let them go?" "Innocent?" Dean coldly looked at her. "Adults who have survived for decades have been killed. Don't you think it's ridiculous that you feel pity for these children? Or do you think that these children are innocent and have never done bad things? Do you think that it's too cruel to kill them?" Gwyneth was startled. She did think so. Dean sneered as he saw her expression. "These children haven't done bad things. It's not because they are kind, but because they don't have the ability. Once they grow up, they will be like ordinary people. What qualifications do they have to enjoy the privilege of being exempted from death? You think that it's cruel? It's just a conditioned reflex caused by your vision, hearing, and imagination." Gwyneth was speechless as she didn't know how to refute. But she knew that such behavior was wrong. But she couldn't say what was wrong. "If we leave these bastards alive today, they will become the most disgusting rats in 10 years. Resources are limited. The resources that they will eat and drink will be left to the slums. It will be enough to feed many families who will die of hunger and poverty." Dean said in a cold voice, "If you don't have the heart to kill them, then you can leave first." Gwyneth was silent. She used to be a punisher in the inner wall. She was specialized in hunting down evil followers and hunters. Although she was framed and imprisoned by the nobles, but she only hated certain people. However, everything she'd done today had truly exceeded her bottom line and tolerance, and it caused her to feel an indescribable feeling of rage and powerlessness. She knew that she was unable to change this young man's thoughts, and it was even to the extent that if she were to oppose him too strongly, she might even be discarded by this young man as a pawn at the side. But was it really right to witness and connive at such a sinful scene in order to protect herself? She slightly bit her lips and raised her hand to make a gesture to the mercenaries. The mercenaries immediately waved their swords and killed the children who were just born to 4 or 5 years old. The ground was a mess. The blood spread like a curse and permeated the dark ground. At this time, Sarah and Lisa slowly woke up. They saw Sergei and Dean not far from them. Sarah was about to scold them when she smelled a strong and pungent smell of blood. Her face slightly changed as she looked up and saw corpses everywhere. She was stunned for a moment. She stared at Dean. "You won't die a good death. You are not a human. You are an ugly monster. You deserve to die." Dean frowned and slightly raised his hand to signal. Sergei understood and immediately chopped Sarah's hand and knocked her out again. Dean waited for Glenn to come back and said, "We will go back first. You stay here and clean up the place. Remember to kill even a mouse." Glenn nodded. "Understood." Chapter 6:11. As soon as Mostyn came out of the tavern, he saw his favorite subordinate rushing towards him. He said drunkenly, "Martin, how many times have I told you that as a priest you have to be calm? Deacon, it's not good." Martin was very anxious. "Something big has happened in Black Harbor Town." Mostyn slightly shook his head and hiccuped. "Black Harbor Town? What could have happened there? Can you speak slowly?" "Cough." Martin hurriedly said, "Recently, the nobles who moved to Crowtown, Mel family had an accident. It seems that they were massacred." Bang! The bottle in Mostyn's hand suddenly fell to the ground. His drunken eyes widened as he sobered up. The Mel family was massacred? What happened? Martin replied, "I don't know the specifics of the situation. The higher-ups told us to rush over to investigate." "Let's go." Mostyn immediately strode towards the carriage parked on the roadside. "Let's go to Black Harbor Town." The speed of the carriage was very fast. After half an hour, they arrived in front of the Mel family's manor in Black Harbor Town. A large number of knights of magistrate had surrounded the place to protect the scene. Although it was almost 9 o'clock, but there were still a large number of people gathered around. Mostyn got off the carriage and was greeted by a knight of magistrate. "Sir Mostyn, you finally came." Mostyn slightly frowned. He smelled a strong smell of blood as he got off the carriage. His heart sank as he walked. "What happened? Tell me in detail." The knight of magistrate replied, "We received a report from the Victor family that someone had attacked the Mel family. When we arrived, the attackers had already left. The people of the Mel family are all dead." Mostyn's footsteps paused as he stared at the knight. "All dead?" The knight of magistrate bitterly nodded. "Yes, all dead." Emo Stein's eyes flashed as he continued walking forward. "Did you find out the identity of the attacker from the enemy's corpse?" Knight of the magistrate hesitated and whispered, "The enemy didn't leave any corpses. They should have been taken away when they retreated. But I heard from passers-by that a large number of people passed by the street half an hour ago. I have sent people to trace the footprints. There should be news soon." Musing snorted, "They dare to attack Mel family at night. Needless to say, there are a lot of them." At this time, he had arrived at the cordon of the judicial knights. He looked up and was stunned. Inside the cordoned area, a few lanterns illuminated the corpses strewn all over the ground. The ground was covered in blood, as though it was a living hell. His expression changed, and he jumped into the cordon. While paying attention to his own footsteps, he took out a handkerchief to cover his mouth and scanned the corpses all over the ground. Soon, his expression changed again and he was furious. Killed. So many of them. Looking at the corpses on the ground, Martin's face turned pale, especially the corpses of some small children. He clenched his fists and said indignantly, "Bastards, they don't even let children off." Knight of the magistrate sighed. "Yes, I have been a knight of the magistrate for many years, but this is the first time I have seen such a bloody scene. The main culprit of this incident has a deep hatred towards Mel family. I have investigated and found that no one was alive at the scene. Whether it was the elderly or the children, they were all killed. The murderer is utterly heartless." Martin angrily said, "It's more than heartless. This is simply not what a human would do." "You are wrong." Emo Stein stared at the corpses all over the ground. "This is what a human would do." Dean sat on the sofa and asked Gabriel to brew a pot of tea. It didn't take long for Glenn and Gwyneth to come back. "How is it? Have the mercenaries settled down?" Dean asked. Glenn nodded. "Everything is settled. The magistrate won't be able to track us for a while. But there are too many people involved in this operation. It will take a long time for them to find us. What should we do next?" Dean replied, "It's their bad luck that they found us." Glenn was startled. Dean turned to look at Sarah and Mel, who were lying unconscious on the floor. He poured a cup of hot tea over them. Both of them were immediately awakened by the tea. They sat up in shock. "Beast, what do you want?" Sarah quickly looked around. She knew that they had arrived at Dean's castle. Her face was ugly, but she was weak inside. Dean indifferently said, "Nothing. I have said that I will give you a surprise when you wake up. Do you know how many people from Mel family died tonight?" Sarah's face changed as she angrily stared at him. "You madman!" Dean continued as if he didn't hear her. "I don't know. But I do know how many people from your family survived tonight. You, your little maid, your father, and 2 doctors. A total of 5. Well, Sarah's pretty face turned pale as she heard Dean's words. Her lips trembled as she asked, what did you do to the others?" "Of course I killed them," Dean said. "Did you invite them for tea?" Sarah felt an unspeakable grief welled up in her heart. She stared at Dean. "Even if I die, I will curse you. I will wait for you in hell." Sarah stared at Dean. "Even if I die, I will curse you. I will wait for you in hell." "Then you will have to wait," Dean calmly said. "Do you know why I left you alive?" Sarah stared at him with resentment. There was a trace of disdain in her eyes as she sneered. "Why? Don't you want to know all the properties of Mel family? You are wrong. No matter how you treat me, I won't tell you even half a word. Maybe I will tell you the wrong information. You better not believe my words." "I've never believed you," Dean said. "You think too highly of yourself. I kept you alive because I want to retaliate against you. I just want you to taste the most painful and desperate things in the world. I have said that I will repay my enemies 100 times. Shouldn't I do what I say?" Sarah was startled. Chapter 6:12. Gwyneth's mind was still immersed in the previous massacre. The bloody picture repeatedly echoed in her mind. She couldn't help but clench her fists whenever she thought of the faces of the children who fell in the pool of blood. There was a kind of regret but helplessness in her heart. She was startled when she heard Dean call her name. She looked up and saw Dean's dark eyes. She nodded. "Yes, young master." Gwyneth looked at Sarah and Lisa, who were lying in front of Dean. There was a trace of coldness in her eyes. If these people didn't provoke Dean, then the innocent servants and children wouldn't have died. Ever since she was framed and imprisoned, she didn't have a good impression of the nobles. She replied in a cold voice, "Master, as far as I know, all the nobles in the outer wall are servants expelled from the inner wall. In addition to Dean, Sergei, Glenn, Gabriel, Mason, and the others were stunned. They were born and raised in the outer wall, so the status of aristocracy in their hearts had long been ingrained. They were as noble as the royal family in the old era. However, the royal family were just servants?" Sarah and Lisa froze. After a while, Sarah reacted and angrily stared at her. "What did you say? You lowly commoner! You dare to blaspheme a noble? Do you think that I will believe you? You will die a horrible death." Sarah and Lisa were stunned for a moment. Gwyneth indifferently glanced at her. "It doesn't matter if you believe it or not. The outer wall has always been called wild land by the inner wall. It means that the people who live in the outer wall don't understand human etiquette and upbringing. It's just like how the people of the outer wall call the barbarians in the radiation area. In the eyes of the people of the inner wall, the people of the outer wall are no different from barbarians." Sarah stared at her and couldn't speak. Gwyneth continued. "The ancestors of the aristocrats of the outer wall were servants of the real aristocrats of the inner wall. They had learned etiquette from the real aristocrat, so their words and actions had aristocratic style. Over time, they felt that they were superior to the commoners. However, many of the senior servants who had been cultivated by the aristocrats were too arrogant and had offended their masters. So they were expelled from the inner wall and ended up in the wild land of the outer wall. Therefore, the nobles of the outer wall are fake. They are only known as nobles in the household register. They don't dare to title themselves. Sergei, Glenn and others were dumbfounded as they heard Gwyneth's words. They knew that Gwyneth wasn't lying. They knew that Gwyneth was a proud girl. She disdained to lie. Moreover, she was from the inner wall, so most of the information she told them was true. However, this news was really shocking. They didn't expect that the noble who was in awe of them was just a servant of the true nobles of the inner wall. Moreover, he was expelled because of his mistakes. Such people were self-proclaimed as nobles in the outer wall. They enjoyed privileges that ordinary civilians couldn't get. Thinking of this, Sergei, Glenn, and the others felt a little ridiculous and ironic. Sarah stared at her. "You're lying. It's not like that. It's absolutely not like that. We nobles were expelled from the outer wall because we violated the taboo. But we are not servants. Our ancestors were real nobles. But they were deprived of their titles. You see, I have blonde hair. I have blonde hair. This is the hair color of the aristocrats. Do you know that? Do you know that?" She grabbed her slightly curly blonde hair and shook it. She was very excited as she looked at everyone. Indeed, blonde hair had always been the symbol of aristocracy. It couldn't be faked. Dudyan calmly raised his hand to signal Gwyneth to continue. Gwyneth looked down at Sarah. "Blonde hair is the hair color of the aristocrats. It is the same in the inner wall. Half of you have aristocratic blood because your ancestors were the closest servants of the aristocrat. Some of them were appreciated by the aristocrats and married to the aristocrats. So you have half of the aristocratic genes and are considered as half aristocrat. But it's just the bloodline. It's nothing. The symbol of aristocracy is the title. Without the title you are nothing. No matter how brilliant your blonde hair is, you are still a civilian. There is nothing special about it." Sarah Mel fiercely stood up and said, "You're talking nonsense. I have aristocratic blood. I'm different from you. You are jealous of me. How can you understand the nobility of aristocratic blood?" Gwyneth slightly frowned. She was about to say something, but Dudyan opened his mouth. "It seems that Miss Sarah doesn't want to hear the truth. Yes, the reality is always dazzling. You have to rely on your eyes to see the reality, but you have to rely on your brain to imagine the beautiful things." Sarah turned her head and stared at him. "If you want to kill, then kill. Why do you talk so much nonsense? Death is a liberation but not a torture." Dudyan indifferently said, "Sergei, I leave the rest to you. Remember, don't kill them. I want to keep them to relieve my boredom when I am in a bad mood." Sergei respectfully replied, "Yes, young master. Thank you, young master." Dudyan waved his hand. "Go." Sergei grinned and grabbed Sarah's shoulder. His other hand hugged Lisa and said, "Two little girls, come with me. Uncle Sergei will let you taste what it's like to be a woman." Sarah's eyes were full of fear as she struggled. "Beast! Let go of me! You lowly commoner! Let go of me!" Sergei didn't care as he took both of them straight upstairs. When Gwyneth and Glenn saw this scene, they immediately knew what would happen to the two of them. They looked at Dudyan, who was sitting on the sofa. They felt that the boy was very different from before. At this time, the sound of horse hooves echoed from outside. Very quickly, a few figures rushed into the hall. It was Nicholas and the few attendants he brought with him. Nicholas was relieved as he saw everyone in the hall. "Master, the cultivation base has been taken back." Dudyan nodded. "Good job and very efficient." Nicholas replied. "Master is overpraising us, but what?" Nicholas hesitated. "Although the cultivation base has been taken back, but I believe that it won't take long for Mel family to get the news. They will send people to attack us. We won't be the opponent of Mel family if we have Glenn, Gwyneth, or Sergei there. Then we might be able to defend the cultivation base. Nicholas hesitated for a moment. Don't worry. Hearing his words, Glenn, Macon and others looked at him strangely. Nicholas's heart skipped a beat as he noticed the strange expression on everyone's face. Master, did I say something wrong? Dudian shook his head. Nicholas was puzzled and wanted to ask again. Glenn said, You don't have to worry about it. The Mel family will disappear from the outer wall from tonight onwards. Nicholas was stunned. Disappear from the outer wall? What the hell is going on? Glenn immediately told him about how Dean led them to slaughter the Mel family after he left. Nicholas was stunned. Blood wash the Mel family? Yes. Glenn nodded. Nicholas was stunned as he looked at Dudian. He had just recaptured the cultivation base, but Dudian had destroyed the Mel family? The Mel family was one of the oldest aristocratic families. Although they were in decline, but there were countless knights and masters employed by the family. How could they be destroyed by Dudian in such a short period of time? Dean got up and said, Since the cultivation base has been recaptured, then manage it well. I will be using it in the near future. Also hire people to expand the cultivation base. There is no upper limit to the area. Invest as much money as you can. He turned and went upstairs. Nicotine was stunned. He retracted his eyes as Aisha disappeared from the corner of the building. At this time, he heard a woman's scream coming from one of the rooms upstairs. He was surprised that someone dared to do such a thing when Dean was angry. He immediately asked Glenn, and Glenn immediately told him about Sergei's matter. Nicholas was lost in thought as he listened. Master's temperament has changed a lot. Glenn sighed. I used to think that he was a very smart and warm-hearted person. I didn't expect that after a few years his murderous aura would get heavier and heavier. Nicholas nodded. He has changed a lot this time. Glenn shook her head. It's a pity that those two women offended him. I felt that he would have great achievements in the future when he was just a primary hunter. Unfortunately, the Mel family didn't know how to appreciate talents. Otherwise they would have sheltered him from the Thornflower prison. He would have pledged his loyalty to the Mel family, and the Mel family would have given birth to a senior hunter. The Mel family would have entered the inner wall soon. It's a pity, sad, lamentable, and hateful. It's just a mistake. She couldn't help but shake her head and sigh. Nicholas said, You can't blame them. Hunters aren't welcomed by the Mel family. Glenn sighed. But if he brought them back, it shouldn't be as simple as revenge. Nicholas narrowed his eyes. Glenn was surprised as she looked at the old man. What do you mean? Master is smarter than all of us think. He would never do something without a return unless he hates the Mel family. Nicholas slowly said. Glenn looked at him. She knew that he had been in contact with Dudian for a longer time than her, so he had a thorough understanding of the boy. His eyes were dark. That night, the members of the magistrate and the branch of the Radiant Church in the vicinity of Crow Harbor Town were woken up one after another. A piece of sensational news spread like wildfire to all the major powers, as well as all the major newspapers. Countless people were awakened from their sleep and busy with their work. Deacon, wake up. There is a big case. How many times have I told you not to disturb my sleep, even if there is a big case? Talk about it tomorrow. Deacon, something happened to the nobles. What? Magistrates and knights of the magistrate quickly rushed to the town. They were doomed to be sleepless tonight. The next day, the headlines of the major newspapers published sensational news. The Mel family that temporarily resided in the small town of Wu Gang was exterminated last night. There was no news of the patriarch Mark and his daughter Sarah Mel. It was unknown whether they were alive or dead. Looking at the news published in the newspaper, Dean took a sip of his breakfast milk. At the same time, in another majestic palace, a handsome young man saw the headlines on the newspaper and immediately gripped the newspaper tightly. His eyes turned red as he roared angrily towards the sky and tore the newspaper in his hand into pieces. The news would make some people happy, but it would inevitably make some people unhappy. The nobles of Scott Consortium, Huashen Consortium and other major consortiums were shocked when they saw the sensational news. Although the Mel family was banned by Dean, but there was no news about the legendary genius. The Mel family had been hiding their strength and development. Although they weren't in their heyday, but they were comparable to the first-class nobles. It was incredible that they were captured overnight. The whereabouts of Mark and his daughter were unknown. They didn't need to think to know that they had fallen into the hands of the villains. There was no difference whether they were dead or alive. There was a magnificent and solemn hall under a manor in Dexingtown. At the moment there were 7 or 8 figures sitting in a room. They were led by a middle-aged man in a black robe. He angrily slapped the table. "Look at this! Mel family has been destroyed in Dexingtown. Why didn't you receive the news until now? Are you waiting for the enemy to attack the headquarters of the 12th District? Are you still dreaming?" The rest of the people kept quiet out of fear, and did not make a sound. Our dark church has been reduced to reading the newspaper to know what is happening outside. Have you been staying underground for too long? Have you forgotten that we live on the surface? The middle-aged man angrily said. No one dared to say a word. Mel family had just cooperated with us, but they were destroyed. It's been a long time since we got the news. We don't even know who the murderer is. How can I explain this matter to the speaker? The middle-aged man angrily said. One of them hesitated for a while. Elder, most of the people who can exterminate the Mel family are enemies with them. Perhaps they are enemies with us too. As long as we follow this point, I believe that we will soon know who did it. Chapter 6:13. Master, the news about the Mel family has spread outside. I'm afraid we won't be able to hide it for long. Nicholas gritted his teeth and went to Dudien's room. There are too many interests involved in the Mel family. Now that they have been massacred, most of the hatred will be transferred to the murderer. Last night I happened to rob the cultivation base. This matter will soon be noticed. Dean flipped through the book and said slowly, "How fast is very fast?" Nicotine calculated for a moment and said seriously, "Within 2 days, they will definitely find out that it was us. 2 days is enough." Dean turned a page and indifferently said, "After 2 days, no one will continue to pay attention to this matter." Nicotine was startled. Time flew by. In the blink of an eye it was time for the elders' meeting. Shoot Wolf had already prepared a suit personally made by a master tailor. His stooped figure looked energetic. He combed his hair in front of the mirror and fastened his tie. Looking at himself in the mirror, he looked like an aristocrat, and he was very satisfied. In order to make himself look more like an evil elder of the Dark Church, he tried to imitate some of the habits of the elders of the Dark Church, such as extravagance, wealth, cold-bloodedness, brutality, and temperament. He grasped these aspects perfectly. He was a natural pretender. "Elder, you seem to be in a very good mood today." Hawkeye came to the room and was ready to pick him up. He saw the smile on Shooting Wolf's face. "I'll be in a good mood as long as I can smell the blood." Shooting Wolf smiled. He picked up his crutches and went straight out of the room. There was a trace of expectation in his eyes. He had been waiting for this opportunity for a long time. In the past few months he had been the elder of the 9th region. He had been thinking about this time every day. He had secretly informed the Pope about the location of the elders' meeting and the number of people present. All the information had been passed to the Pope. He believed that the Pope would not miss this excellent opportunity. He would send the strongest force of the Holy Church to wipe out the evil believers in one fell swoop. At that time he would be recorded in the history of the Holy Church. He would leave a glorious mark. At his age, he no longer had much of a desire for material things, including power. It was difficult for him to be moved, but to be famous throughout the ages was what he looked forward to and desired the most. What kind of luxurious enjoyment would it be to be remembered by people after death? When all the elders are caught in one fell swoop, only the mysterious dark speaker will be left. The dark church will collapse today. The dark church that has been opposing the Holy Church for more than 200 years will collapse because of me. Shooting Wolf thought to himself. The corners of his mouth couldn't help but curl up. Soon, surrounded by Hawkeye and other counselors, Abel came to a luxurious carriage in the manor and sat down. On both sides of the carriage were dark knights and 2 dark head knight captains. They would personally escort Abel to the meeting. "Let's go," Shooting Wolf instructed after they got into the carriage. Eagle Eye saw that he was about to leave and said, "Elder, are you not going to wait for that person?" Shoot Wolf knew who that person was. He couldn't help but recall the powerful strength from the previous fight. He squinted his eyes and said, "No need." Didn't he already know the location of the elders' meeting? Maybe they went there directly. Let's go first and meet up with them when we get there. Eagle Eye wanted to say something but eventually held back. The team set off once again. The dark knights outside the carriage had a cold aura. No one dared to approach. Fillen Town. This was the territory of the Fillen family. 100 years ago there was a female general called Fillen. She repeatedly made great achievements in the battle against the barbarians. She killed countless barbarians and saved tens of thousands of civilians. Because of her illustrious achievements, she was awarded this town. Now, the female general had long passed away. Her descendants followed the example of their ancestors and joined the army. There were many outstanding generals in the family, which made the Fillen family a big family comparable to the Mel family. However, the Fillen family wasn't an aristocrat, so they weren't recruited by consortiums. They were only loyal to the military. Anyone who mentioned the Fillen family in the military was afraid of them. Shooting Wolf's carriage slowly entered Fillen Town. This town was respected by countless civilians. It was the gathering point of the elders' meeting. There was no other reason but because it was the safest place. Shooting Wolf lifted the curtain of the carriage and looked at the scenery on the side of the road. His eyes slightly narrowed as he revealed a bit of coldness. A good hero doesn't want to join the Dark Church and become the dog of the Dark Speaker. Humph! His Highness the Pope should contact the military and take this opportunity to uproot the Fillen family. There should be people in the military who are jealous of this general family. The carriage slowly came to a high mountain behind the town. There was a castle far away from the hustle and bustle of the town. The bluegrass flag of the Fillen family was inserted on all 4 sides. Teams of knights were patrolling outside the castle. The path leading to the castle was filled with the fragrance of flowers and grass. The grass was trimmed. Occasionally, hares could be seen running on the grass. Children were playing on the grass. Shooting Wolf lifted the curtain and saw the children playing on the grass. He noticed that they were wearing clothes embroidered with bluegrass patterns. They were the children of the Fillen family. Poor children! There was a trace of pity in Shooting Wolf's eyes as he looked at the innocent, smiling faces of the children. These children hadn't done anything bad yet. They probably didn't know what kind of disaster they would be involved in. Soon, the carriage arrived in front of the castle of the Fillen family. The carriage was stopped. Shooting Wolf took out the invitation card from his pocket and handed it to a dark knight outside the window. After reading the invitation card, the guard glanced at the knights on both sides of the carriage and said, "The family has ordered that each invitation card can only bring 10 people." Shooting Wolf frowned. He thought for a moment and immediately called a dark knight. "You pick a few good knights and the rest stay outside the castle. Don't go too far." "Yes." Tumaka nodded and turned around to pick a few dark knights. "Please." The guard opened the heavy gate of the castle and made an inviting gesture. Shooting Wolf saw that even a little guard had such a temperament. He secretly respected the Fillen family, but at the same time, he felt a little regretful. They could have been heroes, but they had to fall into the darkness. After entering the castle, Shooting Wolf said to Tumaka, who was outside the window, You stay here. If that person comes, you stay here and wait for him. Tamaka was a little startled, but he quickly responded, It's the previous shoe. Shooting Wolf made a gesture and slightly glared at him. It's fine as long as you know. Why did you say it out loud? Tomark knew that he'd made a slip of the tongue, and he scratched his head. He quickly thought of something and said, Elder, they don't have an invitation, so it's useless for me to welcome them here. We've already brought in 10 people, and the guards will probably not let them in. This, Shooting Wolf saw how simple Tamaka was and couldn't help but shake his head. It's their problem. We've done our duty anyway. Tamaka finally reacted and said with a bitter smile, I know. Tamaka stopped his horse by the door and watched the carriage enter the castle. He got off the horse and squatted by the fountain in the square to wait. After a while, he heard the sound of a carriage coming from outside. He immediately stood on his tiptoes and saw a noble carriage being escorted by 2 groups of knights. He saw the flag on the carriage, and his face slightly changed. He didn't expect to meet his old enemy so soon. Soon, the carriage showed its invitation and was let in by the guards. A middle-aged guard next to the carriage saw Tamaka. He immediately raised his eyebrows and ridiculed. Isn't this Tamaka? What's wrong? Abandoned by the 9th Region? You came here to be a watchdog? Tamaka's face was gloomy. He coldly said, You're still the same. A dog's mouth can't spit out ivory. Really? Then why don't you spit it out for me? The middle-aged man teased. Tamaka was speechless. He coldly snorted, If your knife was as good as your mouth, you wouldn't have been chased by me last time. The middle-aged man's face slightly changed. He sneered, It's obvious that you're being chased by me, but you still dare to make a false accusation. You think you can chase me with your little ability? Tamaka was startled. He didn't expect that the middle-aged man not only denied it, but also said that he was making a false accusation. It seemed that the middle-aged man was telling the truth. He clenched his fist in anger. Who's being chased? Get off the horse and you'll know. Your companions are watching. If you have the guts, come down and fight with me. A trace of gloominess flashed in the middle-aged man's eyes. When he was about to speak again, a hoarse voice came from the carriage. Don't cause trouble. Let's go in first. Hearing this, the middle-aged man lifted the reins and coldly said to Tamaka, You're lucky today. You won't be so lucky next time. With that said, he shook the reins and rode away. Tomark never expected that this person would actually be so shameless, inverting right and wrong, and even speaking as if he was serious. He was so infuriated that he wished for nothing more than to drag him off his horse and have a fight with him. But when he thought about how this was the gathering place of the elders after all, and if he broke the rules rashly, he would inevitably be punished severely, so he gritted his teeth and endured it. A moment later, the sound of the carriage came from outside again. Tamaka stood up and looked. He couldn't help but shiver when he saw that it was the 3rd District's elder. Very soon, the 3rd District's carriage passed the security check and entered the castle. The dark knights on both sides of the carriage noticed Tamaka, who was beside the fountain in the square. They only glanced at him coldly and didn't say anything. They directly passed by the square. Tamaka silently watched them leave. He secretly heaved a sigh of relief and continued to wait. After the 3rd District elder arrived, the other district elders arrived one after another. In the blink of an eye, the sun was already shining on the square. Tomark took out his expensive mechanical pocket watch and glanced at it. It was 10 minutes to 9, and the meeting was about to begin. Are they not coming? Tamaka was puzzled as he looked at the door. There was no flag on the carriage. There were 4 attendants in front of the carriage. They weren't wearing knight's armor but strange hunter's armor. They're coming. His eyes lit up. The guard immediately stopped the carriage. This is the territory of the Philin family. Idlers are not allowed to enter. Dean slowly lifted the curtain and looked at the guard. How do you know that I'm idlers if you didn't ask me for an invitation? The middle-aged guard was startled. He remembered that all 12 guests on the list had arrived. How come there were 13? Suspicious, he said to Dean. Since you are the guest of my master, please show me the invitation. Dean nodded and looked at Sergei, who was in front of the carriage. Show him. Sergei grinned. All right. He jumped off the horse and came in front of the middle-aged guard. The middle-aged guard looked at him strangely. Just as he was about to speak, he saw a black shadow rushing towards him. He was startled, and just as he was about to raise his hand to block, the black shadow had already hit his face. Suddenly, he felt an indescribable pain, and his body retreated several steps, rolling a few times. Sergei shook his hand and grinned. This is an invitation. Does it look good? It's as beautiful as a flower. Glenn jumped down from the other horse. Her figure flickered as she quickly swept towards the other alerted guards. A dagger quietly appeared between her fingers. Her fingertips flashed with a silver light as the guards surrounding her fell down one after another. Blood gushed out of their necks. The battle in front of them seemed to have nothing to do with Dean. He slowly lifted the curtain and got off the carriage. He reached out to hold Aisha's hand as he escorted her down the stairs step by step. All the guards at the gate had fallen to the ground. Sergei, Gwyneth and Noyce stepped over the corpses and blood as they pushed the gate open. Gabriel, keep up. Dean called out to Gabriel, who was acting as the coachman. Gabriel's face turned pale as he saw the corpses of the guards fall to the ground. He had never seen so much blood. The scene of Glenn's group of 4 slaughtering reminded him of the scene of butchers killing pigs in the village. The only difference was that the butchers were always accompanied by the squeals of pigs. Dean tightened the robe that was draped over his shoulders as he led Aisha through the clean ground. He saw a familiar face as he entered the gate. Did they go in? Tamarko's face was pale as he looked at Dean. He thought that Dean would be blocked by the guards and retreat. He didn't expect that Dean would use such a crazy way to break in. It must be known that this was the Fillon family's territory. Yes, they went in. Tamarko came back to his senses and quickly replied, They have all gone in and are waiting for you inside. Dean nodded slightly and led Aisha into the hall. Chapter 6:14. In the depths of the castle of the Fillon family, there were intricate and dark passages that spread throughout the castle. Dark knights were stationed to guard the passages. After passing through one mechanism after another, Shooting Wolf finally led the 9 people to the dark meeting hall where the Elder Conference was held. This was an extremely spacious hall, and the walls were embedded with fist-sized milky white crystals. If anyone thought that these were natural ores, they would be gravely mistaken. These were the fluorescent organs of some kind of demon. Even if they were cut off, as long as they were well preserved, they could continue to glow for several years, even up to 10 years. Shooting Wolf glanced at the hall. He felt that the decorations here, including the round table, the 12 elders' chairs and the decorations on the walls were particularly familiar. It seemed that it was similar to the highest hall of the Holy Church. The only difference was that the hall of the Holy Church was decorated with gold. It was full of holy atmosphere. Moreover, it was bright and transparent. Even at night, people's hair could be seen. However, it was dark here. Even during the day, it was difficult to see the light. Evil people. Even the council hall imitates the Holy Church. Shoot Wolf sneered in his heart. At the same time, he felt a little proud. After he found his seat, he sat down immediately. Only 2 knights were left behind to guard the chair, ready to be deployed at any time. The rest of the people retreated to the dark corner at the back of the hall and waited for further orders. Shooting Wolf's face was indifferent as he looked at the 4 people who had arrived first. There was no expression on his face. However, his eyes stopped on a short old man for a moment. He was secretly shocked. When he had been a librarian and had been the 9th district elder for a few months, he had heard about the most famous people of the Dark Church. The 3 Dark Kings were the most famous people: Sword King, Pluto and Night King. These three people's names were equally resounding in the Holy Church and the Holy Church. Sword King has arrived. Pluto and Night King should be here soon. The Pope should send the Great Light King. Shooting Wolf's eyes flashed. The fear in his heart was replaced by contempt. The Great Light King was the strongest knight of the Holy Church. He was the invincible god of war of the Holy Church. He was also the strongest person in the outer wall. It was said that he was a master even in the inner wall. These mice in the dark would be caught in one fell swoop if he made a move. Thinking of this, the corners of his mouth curled up. He slowly turned his head and quietly looked outside, hoping that time would pass faster. Not long after, more people came in from the outside. They were dressed differently from Shoot Wolf. Most of them were wearing black robes, and a huge hood covered half of their faces. In the dimly lit hall, their faces were even more blurry. Shoot Wolf was dressed in a noble's suit, which made him look a bit different. He also attracted the attention of a few people. This made Shoot Wolf frown. He knew that he had been too careless. However, he believed that this alone wouldn't expose his identity. After all, most of the Dark Church's people were eccentric and twisted. His appearance could also be included in the list of strange hobbies. It wasn't a flaw. It's still the same. It's dark here. Suddenly, a voice came from outside. Then, a skinny, cold-looking young man walked in. He glanced at the hall indifferently. His gaze stopped on Shoot Wolf for a moment. Then, he walked straight to his seat. The second seat at the top. The short old man whom Shooting Wolf had noticed earlier glanced at the cold-looking young man and said, "We have always lived in the dark. Do you want to learn from the Radiant Church and make this place luxurious and dazzling?" After the cold-looking young man sat down, he gently leaned on the back of the chair and indifferently said, "Why not? Who said that the Dark Church's conference hall must be dark? Why can the Holy Church's hall be brightly lit? This is called fitting the identity." The short old man said, "Untouchables should wear the clothes of untouchables. They can't wear the clothes of nobles. Similarly, nobles can't wear the linen clothes of the untouchables. Isn't this monotonous?" The cold-looking young man said, "After a long time, people will get tired of it. Untouchables may one day have the courage to wear the clothes of nobles and eat the food of nobles. Isn't it good to occasionally change the taste? If you eat too much, you will have diarrhea," the short old man indifferently said. Hearing the words of these two people, the rest of the people in the hall were silent. Shoot Wolf saw that the cold-looking young man glanced at him. He knew that the meaning of these words was a warning to him and others. After he became the elder of the 9th District, he didn't pay tribute to the Night King. He also didn't visit him. The 9th District originally belonged to the Night King's influence. His actions obviously angered the King of the Dark Church. However, he didn't expect that the Sword King would speak up for him. It seemed that the relationship between the three kings was not only hostile competition but also cooperation. At this time, a few people came from outside. Shoot Wolf finally saw Hell King, who was the last to arrive. The latter looked like a strong man with a tall and sturdy body. However, his resolute face was full of a decisive temperament. He wasn't a rough and boorish man. "It seems that everyone is here." Hell King sat on the highest chair and glanced at the audience. He slowly said, "In that case, the elders' meeting will officially begin." Everyone, at this point, he suddenly stopped and raised his head to look at the sky. The rest of the people saw his action and looked up in confusion. However, they didn't see any hidden weapons or ambushes on the dome of the hall. One of them said, "Your Majesty Hell King, what are you doing? There are guests coming." The short old man sitting on another chair said coldly. Shoot Wolf was startled. Suddenly, his heart moved. Was that person coming? He couldn't help but look up. He held his breath and listened to the movements on the ground above his head. In the extreme silence, in addition to the breathing of some of the guards brought by the elders, He also heard bursts of increasingly chaotic footsteps coming from the ground above his head. At the same time, there were bursts of harsh sounds of metal colliding. "Someone is invading?" another woman wearing a veil said in surprise. "It seems that there are a lot of guards. It seems that all the guards of the Philin family have been dispatched." Shoot Wolf was delighted. His eyes lit up. "It's His Majesty the Pontiff." He couldn't help but want to stand up and cheer. However, thinking that the people present were enough to kill him before the top was breached, he held back the joy in his heart. He quietly sat on the chair and tried his best to restrain the excitement in his heart. "Sword servant, go out and take a look," the short old man ordered a young man who was serving on the back of the chair. Before he finished speaking, the ground suddenly shook. Then, the sound of sand and stones falling from the top of everyone's head was heard. With a bang, a huge rock suddenly collapsed. The people present reacted very quickly. Before the huge rock hit the conference table, they quickly retreated. Bang! A knight fell from the huge rock and rolled on the ground. He spat out blood and was on the verge of death. At the same time, several figures jumped down from above and stood on the table that was crushed by the huge rock. They directly attacked? When Shooting Wolf saw the collapsed dome of the main hall, he was secretly delighted. When the dust settled, he hurriedly looked up and was immediately stunned. The few people who had jumped down were not the great Light King and the Chief Knight of Light that he had expected, but an extremely familiar young face. It was actually him? While Shooting Wolf was stunned, the rest of the people reacted. The Sword King coldly snorted and said, "So, it is not the great Light King Roa. A nobody dares to behave atrociously here?" Dean looked at the edge of the collapsed hole. The knights of the Philin family were standing in a circle. They were glaring at him. He slowly retracted his eyes and looked at the short old man. "Tell them to retreat. I want to talk to you quietly." The Sword King slightly narrowed his eyes. He had already noticed that the newcomers were not a large group, but the commotion they created was comparable to that of an elite division. It could be seen that these people were not weak, and it was difficult to use numbers to deal with experts, not to mention that the number of knights outside was not a sea of people. He snorted coldly, raised his head and said, "You guys retreat first, let Phil watch the surroundings." Two of the knights outside heard his words and immediately gestured for the others to retreat. "It's smart." Dean said a word of appreciation. He led Aisha down from the boulder and came to a chair that was overturned on the ground. He pulled up the chair and patted the dust on it before sitting down. Sword King and others frowned as they looked at Dean's slow and unhurried appearance. There were a total of 6 people with Dean. They couldn't think of anyone who dared to trespass into this place. It must be known that there were famous masters in the top 20 of the outer wall, especially the 3 king-level masters. All of them were close to the Great Light King. "Boy, what are you doing? Tell me your name. If you want to die, then I'll help you," a strong man said in an angry voice. Dean calmly looked at him. "I'm the previous elder of the 9th region. By the way, my code name also has the word king." Everyone was startled. "You are the previous Devil King of the 9th region?" The burly man was stunned for a moment and then he sneered and said, "Kid, you're really tired of living. You left your post without permission and are wanted by the speaker, yet you still dare to appear here. You're simply courting death. You even codenamed Demon King? How childish and laughable. If you are a devil, then I am the great Devil King." Dean looked at the crowd. "In that case, everyone must have heard of me. Now, boy, don't talk nonsense. Since you are here, then get ready to die." The man interrupted Dean and sneered. He looked at the others. "Everyone, the person that the speaker wants to kill is here. What are you waiting for? Kill him." Dean frowned slightly and glanced at him. "You are really noisy." The bell on his wrist jingled as he shook it. Whoosh! A gust of wind suddenly blew. The dust that had just fallen from the ground gently fluttered in the breeze. The burly man sneered, "Brat, you." His voice stopped abruptly as a cold, sharp palm pierced through his chest, piercing through his heart. He lowered his head in disbelief, and stared blankly at his own chest. A slender arm with snow-white skin really appeared in his eyes. This. How is it possible? The strong man's voice was hoarse. His eyes dimmed as his body fell straight down. Aisha withdrew her palm. The blood in her palm stimulated her instincts. She slightly grinned, revealing a bit of a sinister expression. She raised her hand and gently licked the blood on her fingers as if she was sucking an extremely delicious sauce. Everyone who was ready to attack was stunned as they saw the sudden scene. Sword King, Hell King and Night King's faces changed as they looked at Aisha in horror. Even with their eyesight they couldn't see how the girl appeared in front of Tebri. If she had attacked them at such an unpredictable speed, then they would have been the ones to fall at the moment. The three of them felt a chill run down their spines. The sense of urgency of their lives being threatened, which they had not felt for a long time and had almost forgotten, spread through their hearts. Now it's quiet. Let's continue. Dean slowly said, "From today on, I am the speaker of the Dark Church. You only need to be loyal to me. Is there a problem?" Everyone was stunned. Shoot Wolf's expression was ugly, and his palms were covered in cold sweat. He had not expected the woman behind this young man to be so powerful. Although he could not judge how strong this woman was, he knew from the reaction of the three kings that the woman's previous attack had completely stunned them. With such strength, she could most likely contend against the Great Light King. In that case, if the Great Light King came tonight, there would most likely be a fierce battle. Damn! He cursed in his heart as he clenched his fist. Hell King stared at Dean after a brief silence. Be loyal to you? Although you are strong, but you seem to have nothing. Everything will be born as long as I exist, Dean calmly replied. On the other side, the Night Lord frowned slightly and said coldly, Do you think you're God? Do you think there is light when you say there is light? Dean nodded. Yes. Night King snorted. Although you are strong, but it is a bit difficult to defeat the three of us at the same time. I advise you to leave as soon as possible so that nothing has happened. It is impossible for you to be the speaker. The speaker won't allow you to exist. You may not know, but the speaker of the Dark Church can communicate with the inner wall. Although your strength is good, but there are many masters in the inner wall. Any one of them is enough to kill you. If that is the case, then why don't they send a master to help you flatten the Holy Church? Dean quietly looked at him. Chapter 6:15. What you said is very reasonable, but it is useless. Dudian indifferently said, I only give you two choices. Either surrender to me and respect me as the king, or die here. Make your choice. Everyone's face slightly changed as they looked at each other. No one made a sound. After waiting for a few minutes, Dudian saw that no one spoke. Since it is difficult for you to choose and you don't want to be the first bird, I will ask one by one. You can choose the small roll. Small roll? The middle-aged man who was pointed at by Dudian was startled. He frowned as he heard the strange name. What do you mean by small roll? My code name is Guardian. Small roll means that I don't need to know your name. Dudian interrupted him. Stop the nonsense. Which one do you choose? The Guardian didn't expect Dudian to be so arrogant. He didn't put him in his eyes at all. His eyes were gloomy as he slightly clenched his fingers. If it was someone else who despised him like this, then their head would have been separated from their body. But thinking of Tebri, who was killed in an instant, he couldn't help but look at the girl who exuded a dangerous aura. His face slightly changed as he whispered, I am willing to surrender to you. Since you have chosen to surrender, then you should use honorific. Dudian indifferently said. The Guardian's teeth slightly clenched, but there was no trace of anger on his face. He bowed his head. The Guardian is willing to surrender to you. Dudian said, louder. The Guardian's face turned ugly as he bowed his head. The Guardian is willing to surrender to you. His voice spread to the outside of the hall. The guard knew that once he said this, there was no turning back. Once Dean was defeated, even if he begged for mercy, the speaker would not let him go easily. From the moment his voice spread to the outside, it was already destined that he would set foot on Dean's boat. Dudian nodded and pointed to another person next to him. "It's your turn. Night King, Sword King, Hell King, are we really going to submit to him? Instead of being defeated one by one, why don't we join forces and fight to the death with him? I don't believe that with so many experts gathered here, we'll be afraid of just 7 of them." The second person named by Dudian was a very tall middle-aged man. He didn't say anything and immediately turned to Sword King and the others. He didn't want to surrender, but he didn't dare to face Dean alone. At this moment he took the risk to say these words. Sword King and the others were arrogant. They wouldn't easily surrender to others. Hearing his words, the Sword King and the others' expressions changed slightly. The 3 of them exchanged glances and communicated with each other. "Foolish," Dean said indifferently. He suddenly raised his hand and a black light flew out. Puff! A dagger suddenly appeared on the middle-aged man's throat. More than half of the dagger went in, and blood quickly overflowed. The middle-aged man covered his throat as he looked at Dean in disbelief. His attention was focused on the girl who killed Tebri when he said those words. He didn't expect that Dean would personally kill her. Moreover, he would throw the knife to kill her. The middle-aged man's body struggled to fall down. He tightly covered his throat. His trachea was cut, but he didn't suffocate to death. It was only a matter of time before he died. Sword King, right? Dean's eyes fell on the short old man. Which one do you want to choose? Sword King was shocked. The speed of Dean's throwing knife was so fast that he couldn't see it clearly. In other words, in addition to the girl, Dean himself was not inferior to them. If it was only the girl, then he was confident that with so many people they could escape even if they couldn't beat her. But Dean's strength wasn't weak. Moreover, there were 5 other people. It was hard to guarantee that there wouldn't be a master like the girl. Thinking of this, he slowly recovered. He looked at Dean's indifferent eyes. He felt that the youth's calm and deep eyes seemed to penetrate into the depths of his heart. There was a kind of cramped feeling that there was nowhere to hide. Sword King, let's join hands. The Night King saw that the Sword King was a little shaken. Noisy. Dean glanced at him. His figure suddenly flew out from the chair like a black lightning and instantly rolled up a gust of wind. His figure whistled through the wind and went straight to the front of the Night King. The Night King was aghast and instinctively retreated. But the speed of his retreat was completely incomparable to Dean. In the blink of an eye, Dean was already in front of him. Night King didn't see Dean make a move, but he felt a bone-chilling palm on his throat, choking him to the point of suffocation. In front of them, you are the king. Dean grabbed the Night King's throat and lifted his body. In front of me, you are nothing. The Night King looked at him in fear. He never thought that he would become so weak that he couldn't resist. However, he was after all a veteran. He didn't panic in this critical moment. His palm suddenly pulled out the sword from his waist and chopped towards Dean's arm. With a clanging sound, the saber stopped halfway through its swing. Dean's other hand was holding the knife, and the sharp blade of the poisonous knife cut his palm. It was like cutting metal, making a hard and sharp sound. Ignorant! Dean clenched his fingers. Gotcha! His fingers pierced into the Night King's throat and crushed his Adam's apple. Gotcha! The Night King didn't have time to scream. His eyes widened as blood flowed from the corner of his mouth. His body lost strength and his arm fell down. Dean loosened his grip, and the sword fell to the ground with a clang. The rest of the people were scared to the point that their hair stood up. Dean threw away the body of the Night King. He took out a handkerchief and wiped his palms as he walked back to his seat. The hall was quiet. Both King of Hell and King of Sword, who were ready to attack, were stunned in place. They looked at the scene in disbelief. The shock in their hearts couldn't be any greater. Why do you always feel pain after being slapped? Dean slowly wiped his palms. I thought that at least you have a bit of eyesight since you can get to this position. I didn't expect you to be a group of stupid mediocre people. I have the confidence to defeat you and the chairman. Why do you have to use your life to test the strength of the enemy? Is your life so cheap that you don't know how to cherish it? Everyone was startled as they looked at the youth. If there was any hope in their hearts before, then there was only despair now. As one of the three kings, the Night King was killed by Dean in seconds. He didn't even have the ability to fight back. Such power was far above them. Even if all of them attacked together, they would die in vain. Don't know how to cherish life? It's obviously you who killed indiscriminately. Shooting Wolf came back to his senses. He felt a bit complicated. Although the death of the Night King made him very happy, but the appearance of a person who was much more terrifying than the three kings. With this person joining the Dark Church, the Luminous Church would most likely suffer heavy losses in the future. He secretly prayed that the Pope would be aware of the sudden situation and stop the attack. Otherwise, even if the Great Light King came tonight, he would die here. You haven't answered me yet, Sword King? Dean looked at the Sword King. The Sword King's face was ugly. His palms were full of cold sweat. He slightly gritted his teeth. I am willing to surrender to you. His voice was very loud. He didn't let Dean repeat the previous lesson. Dean nodded and pointed to another person. What about you? I am willing to surrender to you, Devil King. I am also willing to surrender to you. The others didn't wait for Dean's guidance as they immediately took the initiative. They already knew that the situation was hopeless and stubborn resistance would only lead to destruction. Instead of letting Dean ask, it was better to take the initiative. It would also show that they were more active and sincere. I am also willing to surrender to you. Pluto bowed respectfully. In the blink of an eye, everyone bowed to Dean to show their surrender. Dean looked at it and nodded. Not bad, you have a bit of brain. Everyone was silent as they heard his slightly mocking praise. They began to think about their future plans. After all, surrendering to Dean was a small matter. The biggest problem was the chairman of the Dark Church. Elder, I don't know what your plans are in the future. The chairman of the Dark Church can contact the powerhouses of the Inner Wall. I'm afraid if the Inner Wall sends the powerhouses to deal with you. Sword King was worried. You don't have to worry about this, Dean indifferently said. From today the 12th region of the Dark Church is a whole. I don't want to see any internal strife. As for the chairman of the Dark Church and the Holy Church, I will personally solve them tomorrow. I only have one request for you. Unify all the consortiums, nobles and commoners within a week. Everyone was startled. Shoot Tiger's face changed as he heard Dean's words. He was nervous as he fell into deep thought. Pluto looked at Dean. Elder, the foundations of the 6 consortiums and all the nobles are spread all over the forces. I'm afraid to unify them within a week. Dean indifferently looked at him. In terms of foundation and influence, are they as deep as the Dark Church? The Nether King hastily said, Of course not. It only took me one night to unify all of you. But you have 7 days to unify the 6 consortiums. Do you think it is difficult? Dean said in a cold voice. Pluto was startled. The others' faces slightly changed. Sword King was aware of Dean's thoughts. Elder, do you mean that we should forcibly unify the consortiums? All the rules are forced. Dean indifferently said, It's just the difference between fast and slow. Sword King asked, What if the nobles vigorously resist? Then use a more powerful means to suppress them. I know. Sword King bowed his head and didn't say anything more. Dean's indifferent eyes slowly swept through the crowd. I know that some of you are pretending to surrender to me. You will run to the chairman and cry about the betrayal. But I have to remind you that no master will like a dog that has rebelled. Even if you can avoid death, you may not be able to get an important position in the future. So do your best. Sword King and others' faces slightly changed. Indeed, some of them had such a plan. Although Dean was very strong, but the gap was too far compared to the inner wall. Moreover, the chairman was backed by the inner wall, so naturally, he was the biggest backer. If you follow me, then you will get things that you didn't dare to hope for before. Dean's eyes lit up. Now I want to ask a few things. I will reward anyone who can provide effective information. Reward? Everyone pricked up their ears as they curiously looked at the teenager. First, who knows the Pope's preferences? Dean asked. Everyone looked at each other. It was obvious that Dean was ready to deal with the Pope. I know, Pluto said. According to the information I have, the Pope likes Master Benny's music. He rarely misses Master Benny's concert. Dean nodded. This information is good. From today on you will be in charge of the 12th district. You will be promoted to deputy chairman. Pluto was surprised. Thank you, Elder. Others blinked their eyes in disbelief. How could he get such a reward just by providing such information? How could he be promoted to deputy chairman? The second question, does anyone know the whereabouts of the genius magic master who appeared out of nowhere not long ago? Sword King asked. Elder is referring to the genius called Dean? Dean nodded. Yes. I know. Someone eagerly opened his mouth. According to the news I got from the Temple of Elements, this genius was recognized by the inner wall and was sent to the inner wall. Nonsense. Another woman with white skin said. I got news that the genius was forcibly taken away by the people of the inner wall. They said that he colluded with the Dark Church and will be taken to the inner wall for investigation. Humph. The first person snorted. You don't know about this. The inner wall deliberately slandered him and brought him to the inner wall. If he really colluded with us, then how would the inner wall know about it? If they knew, then how would there be no evidence? If there was evidence, why would they bring him back for investigation? They would have killed him on the spot. The woman with white skin frowned. Then why would the inner wall do this? Isn't it smearing his reputation? The first person shrugged. How would I know? Does anyone else know? Dean interrupted the dispute between the two. The others looked at each other but didn't speak. Chapter 6:16. Everyone was surprised as they looked at each other. They hadn't heard of this matter, but they didn't expect Dean to know about it. It was obvious that the other party's intelligence network was wider and deeper than their grasp. Even, it had penetrated into the inner wall. Everyone was secretly awe-inspiring as they thought of this. They felt that it was possible to solve the Dark Parliament's problem. Moreover, Dean's strength was far beyond the level of hunters. It was impossible to have such a powerful strength if he didn't have a background in the inner wall. It was important to know that only the inner wall had God's marrow. Although they could exchange it through secret channels, but the price was expensive and the quantity was very small. It would take a long time to accumulate God's marrow to help people to break through the hunter's limit. Dean squinted his eyes as he asked the question. His broad vision allowed him to notice everyone's expression at the same time. Hearing this third question, the Nether King was slightly startled. He was shocked that this cold youth's intelligence was so extensive. He actually knew such a secret. He thought that he was the only one who knew about Dean's adoptive parent. After all, the area where the genius lived wasn't far from the area under his jurisdiction. Pluto had noticed the genius when he became famous. He sent people to monitor him in secret, and the harvest was not small. He knew that the genius was suffering from some kind of disease when his adoptive mother brought a medical kit into his castle. Moreover, it was a disease that couldn't be known by others. Secret was a person's weakness. It was also the best weapon that could be used. It was great news for him. He could use this point to make Dean join him. Unfortunately, he didn't dig out the information from the woman's mouth. He was about to blackmail Dean, but Dean was taken away by the inner wall. He had no choice but to regret his actions. But he didn't think that he wasn't the only one who knew about this matter. Thinking of this, he secretly looked at Dean. Suddenly, he thought of a place that he had neglected. When he chose to publish the news of the death of Dean's adoptive parents in the newspaper, his purpose was to let the new elder of the 9th region, who was in front of him, know about it. The purpose of letting the youth know about the death was to verify whether he was the genius sent by the monastery or not. After all, the monastery was the one who took away Dean. Pluto was also from the monastery, so he knew a little about the monastery's way of doing things. Could it be? He was surprised and looked up at Dean quietly. He saw that Dean was also staring at him. Dean's eyes seemed to go straight to the depths of his heart, exposing all his secrets. Pluto's heart tightened as he lowered his head. Cold sweat overflowed from his palms. No, it must be a mistake. Pluto thought to himself, that kid is only talented in divine technique. He can't be compared to this person. Even with the resources of the mystic sect, he can only reach the same level as me. It's impossible for him to be so strong. He can easily kill a top hunter like the Night King. This is at least the level of a high-level frontiersman. I must be thinking too much. Pluto's heart gradually relaxed as he thought about the previous 2 questions. Asking about the Pope's preferences should mean that he wants to defeat the Dark Church and start a war with the Pope. Asking about this genius should mean that he wants to get this person. After all, this genius is too powerful. He can repel the barbarians by himself. He only needs to produce a legendary item to be comparable to 10 or more senior hunters. His mood was completely relaxed as he thought of this. He was about to report to Dudian, but he was stunned. The next moment his pupils shrank and his body was covered with goosebumps. No! Pluto's heart was full of horror. Why would he ask who killed the kid's adoptive parents? Wasn't his goal to find out what his adoptive parents knew? Why didn't he ask the people who killed his adoptive parents if they knew this information from them? Isn't this the most important point? Pluto's heart was pounding, but soon he thought, maybe I'm thinking too much? He just wants to ask who killed his adoptive parents first, and then ask if he knows anything about it. Pluto hesitated as he thought about this possibility. His intuition told him that there was something strange about this matter. He pondered for a moment and chose to remain silent. He thought to himself, I'm already the deputy speaker. There's no need for me to claim any more credit, lest others get jealous of me. Besides, if he's that divine incantation kid, I'm dead meat. Why? Doesn't anyone know? Dean narrowed his eyes as he saw that no one answered. Everyone looked at each other, looking at each other, but no one spoke. Who is the 4th elder? Dean frowned. A middle-aged man shrouded in a black robe, short and fat like a bucket, hastily said, It's me. Dean stared at him. As far as I know, the place where they died is in your jurisdiction, right? Yes. The stout middle-aged man said in embarrassment, but I really didn't pay attention to such insignificant people. Who would have thought that they would know about the genius in the divine incantation? If I had known earlier, I would have directly kidnapped them and interrogated them. Dean stared at him for a long time. He turned to Pluto. Do you know anything? Pluto's heart tightened. Elder, this subordinate didn't pay attention to these small characters. Really? Dean stared at him. Pluto's heart beat faster as he looked at Dean's eyes. It seemed that all of his thoughts had been seen through. However, he was in a high position for many years, so he responded quickly. Elder, this subordinate really doesn't know. But this subordinate will go back and investigate the cause of death. Cause of death? Dean narrowed his eyes. Don't you know? Pluto was startled as his heartbeat sped up. He clenched his fists and looked at Dean. Elder, I really didn't know. Although I thought about using the adoptive parents of the genius to threaten him to help the Dark Church manufacture the inventions. But then I thought that they were just adoptive parents and their feelings weren't deep. Moreover, as far as I know, the genius was forcibly recruited to the scavenger training camp after he was adopted by his adoptive parent. They spent less time together, so I didn't do that. In case we fail, we will be exposed and will arouse the vigilance of other forces. The others nodded slightly as they heard his words. Indeed, they had similar thoughts, but they gave up because of the same reason. After all, the halo of that genius was too bright at that time. Moreover, he was a person who had been appointed by the Night Hall. It could be said that he had a bright future ahead of him. It was unrealistic for him to abandon his halo and join the dark church for the sake of his adoptive parents. Dean stared at Pluto for a moment before slowly retracting his eyes. When everyone thought that the question was over, he looked at Pluto again. "Did you kill them?" Pluto's heart contracted as cold sweat overflowed from his body. He felt that he was completely seen through as he looked at Dean's eyes. After all, lying was a guilty thing. Although he was sophisticated enough to lie, but this matter was related to his life and death. Dean had pointed it out in front of his face. It was a kind of shock for him. In the next second, he reacted and said with a bitter face, "Sir, I really didn't kill them. If I did, I would definitely report it to you. Please believe in my loyalty." Dean stared at him for a moment, then retracted his eyes again. "I believe you. It was just a joke. Don't take it to heart." Pluto cursed in his heart. Joke? Who is joking with you? Although he was angry, but he was basically sure that the person in front of him was absolutely the genius Dean. Moreover, he was 100% sure that Dean was brought into the inner wall from the moment he took up the position of Elder of the Ninth Region. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but feel shocked. He didn't expect a genius in divine incantations to grow to such a terrifying degree. Especially his strength, it was even more terrifying than his own attainments in divine incantations. However, he admired himself. Fortunately, he was quick enough to react. He wasn't greedy or he would have been killed by now. But why would he ask about me? Could it be that I've been exposed? Pluto calmed down as he secretly pondered. He decided that the first thing he would do after going back was to kill all the people who knew about the incident. That included his trusted confidant and secretary. That's all for today. You can disperse. In the future, there will be no ranking in the 12 district. Just do your job. Dudian indifferently said. Everyone looked at each other and respectfully said, "Subordinates will retire." Dudian looked at Sword King. "Go and tell the people above to not make too much noise." Sword King immediately replied, "Yes, subordinate will go." With that said, he leaped up and climbed up the pillar of the hall with his bare hands. He quickly leaped up the hole in the dome and communicated with the Philin family's higher-ups who had gathered outside. Dean quietly sat on the chair, gently rubbing his fingers. He seemed to be thinking about something, but also seemed to be waiting for something. The rest of the people left the hall with their men. Pluto didn't dare to fall behind. He looked at Dean and whispered, "Subordinate will also retire." Dean was still looking at the table that was crushed by the boulder. His expression didn't change as he heard Pluto's words, "You stay. As the deputy speaker, I have something to tell you." Pluto was startled. He respectfully replied, "Yes." The rest of the people retreated after a moment. There was only Dean, Pluto and his men in the hall. Cold wind poured in through the hole in the dome, blowing the dust on the ground. The air was silent. Pluto was nervous as he looked at Dean. He wanted to speak, but he was afraid to disturb Dean, so he held back. Dean slowly recovered after a long time. He looked at Pluto. "Come with me. I'll take you to a place." Pluto was startled. "Yes." Dean jumped straight to the edge of the hole in the dome. He raised his hand and made a few rhythmic snaps. A slender figure jumped up from the bottom of the hall and quietly stood beside him. Dean took her hand and slowly moved forward. The soldiers of the Philin family that surrounded the area had long since retreated. There was no one around, only blood stains on the ground. This was the result of the previous attack. Sergei, Pluto and the others had also arrived by the time Dean arrived at the entrance of the Philin family. Dean sat in the carriage and ordered to set off. Pluto also sat in his own carriage. He led his guards to follow behind Dean's carriage. The night was as cold as water and silent. At the moment the curfew was over. There was no one on the streets except for the patrolling soldiers and carriages of the nobles. Dean's carriage gradually came to the suburbs. It was getting farther and farther away from the bustling street. Pluto's face changed as he saw the remote road. He didn't know where Dean was taking him. Was it his secret stronghold? The carriage stopped in front of the woods after 2 hours. Sergei, Glenn, Gwyneth and others were puzzled as they looked around. They didn't know where this place was as they had never heard Dean mention it before. Gabriel looked at the carriage behind the curtain. "Master, we have arrived at the place you told us about." Dean lifted the curtain and looked at the carriage. There was a deep pain in his eyes. He slowly got off the carriage and said to Pluto, "Come down." Pluto had been paying attention to the surroundings along the way. He was puzzled as he saw this strange and remote place. There was a sense of danger in his heart. His intuition told him that he should escape immediately. But he resisted the impulse as he thought of Dean's amazing speed and strength. He got off the carriage and respectfully asked, "Elder, where are we?" "This is the cemetery of my adoptive parents, Gray and Jura, and another child they adopted," Dudian slowly said. His voice was emotionless, as cold as the cold wind. Pluto's pupils shrank as he heard Dean's words. He didn't expect Dean to admit it. Moreover, this was the cemetery of his adoptive parents. After recovering from his shock, he suddenly turned around and ran. Dean's figure flashed and appeared in front of Pluto. "Where are you going?" Pluto braked and abruptly stopped his body. At the same time, he pulled out the machete from his waist and stabbed towards Dean's throat. Dean pinched Pluto's wrist and gently twisted it. Crack! The sound of bones breaking echoed as Pluto's wrist was bent in a 90-degree position. Pluto was in unbearable pain. But at the moment of life and death, he didn't care so much. He quickly punched and spat out something. Dean seemed to have expected it. He tilted his head and dodged a small black object that was shot out from the man's mouth. At the same time, he grabbed the man's fist and twisted it again. Gotcha! The man's hand was broken. Dean squeezed his hands and looked at him indifferently. "Are you wondering why I know that you killed them?" Chapter 6:17. When you killed them, did you hear their pleas? Dean's tone was slow as he spoke. The pain continued to spread throughout Pluto's body. The bones in his broken wrist were being ground bit by bit. Pluto's forehead was covered with cold sweat. "Elder, I really didn't. Please don't believe the slander of the villains. Please believe me." Pluto looked up and pleaded in a sincere tone. At the same time, Pluto's men reacted. They pulled out their swords and rushed over. Sergei, Glenn and others didn't sit back and watch. They quickly came up to greet them. The sound of weapons clashing echoed around them. Only 2 of them had a big reaction when I asked the third question. Dean slowly said, "The other one didn't react as frequently as you. Your psychological activities are repeatedly changing. I forgot to tell you that one of my magic mark's abilities is X-ray vision. I can see your heartbeat, the movement of your stomach and even the flow of your blood." X-ray vision? Pluto was stunned. How could Dean have such a top-level vision ability? His heart fell into the deep valley. He was full of despair. But he didn't want to accept his fate. He pleaded, "Elder, I admit that I was thinking a bit too much at that time. But isn't it too hasty to judge that I killed your adoptive parents based on this point? I just thought of other things. That's why I had a big reaction. But it has nothing to do with your adoptive parents. I really didn't kill them. You are looking for the wrong person for revenge. You will only let the real murderer go. It's better to kill the wrong person than to miss it," Dean indifferently said. "Moreover, the evidence that you are the murderer isn't limited to this point. The reason why I haven't killed you is because there is one more thing that you haven't done." Pluto felt that he had grasped a glimmer of hope. "Elder, you really can't kill me. You have just promoted me to deputy speaker. If you kill me now, then it will provoke criticism. I can promote you to deputy speaker at any time. You don't need to pay attention to criticism. Both of Pluto's hands were completely twisted off. Even a strong person like Pluto couldn't bear the pain of having his wrists broken. I will take this opportunity to tell them that any power or position is under my control. Dean grabbed Pluto's shoulder and carried him into the woods. Whoosh! The three attendants who were fighting with Sergei saw the opportunity and rushed towards Dudian. Dean didn't even look at him. He raised his hand and slapped the man's sword away. His palm pressed on the man's chest. The man flew out and hit another attendant. Try to keep them alive, Dean said as he carried Pluto into the woods. In the dark forest, the low chirping sounds of insects and the rustling of leaves in the wind could be heard. It was as if there were countless ghosts and evil shadows leaping about in the forest, causing people to tremble in fear. Dean's face didn't change. He carried Pluto to an open space in the wood. There was a small mound on the ground. There was no tombstone on it. With a wave of his hand, he threw the Nether King in front of the small mound and said, "Kneel." Pluto clenched his teeth in pain. He used his knees and shoulders to prop himself up from the ground. His heart turned cold as he heard Dean's words. He knew what Dean wanted him to do. He didn't think that he would fall into such a miserable situation. He had to kneel down in front of a few ants. Even if he knelt down, he wouldn't be able to save his life. Gritting his teeth, he slowly stood up from the ground and said, "Even if I die, I won't die on my knees. That's right, I was the one who killed your adoptive parent. I was the one who sent people to kill them. Not only did I send people to kill them, I even tortured them to death. Didn't you see how they died? How miserable they were? Ha ha! You were actually able to hold back your desire to take revenge. In the end, your feelings for them are only SOSO. Pluto's voice suddenly stopped as he knelt down. He saw Dean kick him from behind, and it happened to hit the soft ribs behind his knees. Pluto's eyes turned red as he roared. He wanted to stand up again. Dean's palm pressed on his shoulder. It was like a mountain was pressing down on him. Pluto couldn't move. "Kowtow," Dean indifferently said. Pluto roared, "Don't even think about." He didn't finish his words as his body bent down. His head hit the ground. Dean pressed the back of Pluto's head on the soil in front of the mound. "Kowtow again." Dean grabbed Pluto's hair and pulled him up. He didn't wait for Pluto's eyes to see the front as his head was pressed down again. The coarse sand on Pluto's forehead hurt like needles. Again. Dean pulled Pluto's hair and knocked him down again. He slowly knelt down and pressed Pluto's head on the ground. He whispered to the mound, "Aunt Jura, Uncle Gray, I've brought the murderer who killed you. Did you see him? He is repenting and making amends." "You want me to make amends? Don't even think about it," Pluto roared. Dean pressed hard with his palm, pressing his whole face into the soil. Suddenly, he couldn't open his mouth. "Unfortunately, I'm still too late." Dean looked at the small mound. There was a trace of loneliness in his indifferent eyes. "I've made you suffer so much. You should have lived an ordinary life and be happy until old. But because of me, although you have lived a few good days, but you have paid too much. It seems that the most useless thing in the world is to apologize. Nothing can be restored, nothing can be changed." Pluto twisted his neck as he listened to Dean's voice. He violently struggled, but his face was pressed down. He could only make nasal sounds. "I wish you a good journey." Dean stared at the mound for a moment. He slowly retracted his eyes. His hand that was pressing the back of Pluto's head slowly slid down and pinched Pluto's neck. In an instant, the struggling Nether King's body froze, as though time had stopped. "Woo!" A sobbing sound rang out, and in the next moment, a loud and clear sound of bones breaking rang out. The Nether King's neck was squeezed so hard that it looked like an hourglass. His voice stopped abruptly, and his body gradually went limp. Dean slowly got up and looked back. He saw that Sergei and the others had finished their battle. They brought the 4 people into the woods. "Kneel down," Dean calmly said. Sergei and the others looked at the mound. They knew that it was the grave of Dean's adoptive parents. They pushed the 4 people and forced them to kneel in front of the grave. The 4 people didn't dare to resist as they saw Pluto kneel down. Dean silently looked at them for a long time. He made a gesture to Sergei and the others. Then he led Aisha out of the wood. Sergei immediately made a move. Several screams echoed in the woods. There were 5 figures kneeling in front of the mound in the dark woods. It was particularly treacherous in the dark night. Dean went out of the woods and got into the carriage. He looked at Gabriel, who was nervous and sweating. "Are you afraid?" Gabriel swallowed his saliva and shook his head. "No, I'm not afraid." Dean sat back in the carriage and put down the curtain. Sergei, Glenn and others came out of the woods and got on their horses. Dean's voice echoed from behind the curtain. "Go to Utopia Mountain." Sergei, Glenn, and the others were shocked when they heard this. Sergei said, "Master, Utopia Mountain is the headquarters of the Holy Church. Are you going to deal with the Pope now?" "Do I need to pick an auspicious day to deal with him?" Dean said. Sergei replied, "Master, I didn't mean that. It's so late. You can go back and rest if you are tired." Sergei hurriedly said, "Master, I mean that Holy Church is much more powerful than the Dark Church. Moreover, Wu Tua Mountain is their headquarters. There are countless Knights of Light stationed there. We only have a few people. Shouldn't we go back and gather people? We need to make a long-term plan. Giving the enemy time to breathe is the same as reducing our own time to breathe." Dean's voice was calm. "I have a plan. Gabriel, let's go." "Yes, young master." Gabriel was terrified. He hurriedly responded and rode his horse back. Sergei, Glenn and others looked at each other. They didn't expect Dean to be so anxious. Did he plan to completely control the 2 strongest forces in the outer wall in just one night? Utopia Mountain. The headquarters of the Holy Church. It was the symbol of holiness and beauty. The mountain was 580 meters high. The snow-white sunflowers that covered the mountains and plains were bright and tender, incomparably beautiful. But now that it was a rainy season with continuous rain, they gradually withered and were corroded by the drizzle. "Do you want to attack us at night?" "Yes, even those dirty bitches of the Dark Church never dare to attack the headquarters of the Holy Church. You must have drunk too much." St. Mark's Square on the top of the mountain. The ground was as white jade. The stars were shining brightly. There were knights guarding the square. They were standing still like stone statues. In the light palace, above the square, fragrant oil lamps were hung on the pillars of the palace. The price of each oil lamp was equivalent to the income of a commoner for half a lifetime. The incandescent flames illuminated every corner of the palace, without the slightest bit of darkness. Richelieu was sleeping on the bed behind the statue of the God of Light. He had been living here since he became the Pope 30 years ago. He slept with his back against the statue every day. The light from the lantern shone on his snow-white hair and beard, emitting a radiance. Suddenly, a cold wind came from the window. One of the windows was opened. A gray figure quietly and slowly approached his bed and knelt down. Richelieu slowly opened his eyes but did not get up. His voice was cold. "What's the matter?" If someone heard his tone, they would be surprised. It was completely different from his usual gentle tone. It was as if he was a different person. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Nights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.